In the quiet, almost pensive air of the early 20th century, a new kind of psychology was taking shape, and it would be born out of conflict as much as curiosity. The person at the center of that turning point, Carl Gustav Jung, was not a solitary genius stepping out of a laboratory to reveal a sealed door to the mind. He was a Swiss physician who lived at the edge of a cultural transition, from a century of confident empiricism to a century asking what lies beneath the observable, what hides in dreams, myths, and symbols. To understand Jung's life and the landscape that formed him is to trace a biography that is at once intimate and historical, personal and planetary. The story begins in a Swiss town and unfolds through a set of encounters, inside his own soul and outside in the wider world, that would eventually seed a distinct tradition in psychology, one that would speak in the language of archetypes, dreams, and myth, even as it insisted on rigor and clinical attention. Jung was born in 1875 in Keswil, a small Swiss village by Lake Constance, a place where the social world was orderly, Protestant, and anchored in the rhythms of a life far more local than global. He grew up within a family and environment that valued moral seriousness and intellectual curiosity. His father, a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, provided a home where questions about destiny, meaning, and the order of the world were not idle concerns, but daily interlocutors of a child's waking hours. Yet the boy who would become Jung did not merely inherit a set of pious routines. He carried from an early age a restless inner life, a sense that the mind could hold more than the surface appearances of things. He studied medicine at Basel University, an institution that would expose him to the frontiers of medical science while retaining the older, more contemplative cast of European thought. Basel was a crossroads in which Swiss rationalism, German philosophy, and a medical culture steeped in clinical observation and careful description met and intermingled. From the outset, Jung's interests ran toward the strange margins of human experience. He read not only the standard medical texts, but also the mythic and the symbolic, stories, fairy tales, and religious texts that spoke of dreams as meaningful, not merely as random brain noise. His fascination with dreams, with the images that rose from the night as if from a language older than waking life, would not be a private curiosity, but a core field of inquiry he would later transform into a scientific project. Dreams for Jung were not just personal byproducts of the psyche's malfunctions. They were doors into a deeper layer of the mind, a layer that carried the traces of collective human experience, a layer that predated the individual's biography. Jung's medical training brought him into contact with the clinical world in Basel and in the psychiatric hospital at Bergelsli in Zurich, where Eugen Bleuler was reshaping the field of psychiatry. There, Jung observed the mind's fragility and resilience in a hospital setting that was both rigorous and open to the ambiguities of patient experience. It's a striking thing to imagine the young clinician in those rooms, listening to patients, tracing the patterns of their narratives, noting how a dream could illuminate a symptom, or how a patient's life story could reveal a structure more telling than any single act of pathology. In that environment, Jung's sense of the irrational, of symbols, of myths that organize inner life could begin to take on a clinical seriousness. It would be a mistake to see Jung only as a thinker who turned away from science toward myth. Rather, he moved to reconfigure what science could mean by embracing the symbolic, the imaginal, the mythic as legitimate data about the soul's structure. If there is a hinge moment in Jung's early career, it is his encounter with Sigmund Freud in 1907. Freud, the architect of psychoanalysis, had already begun to articulate a new science of the mind, one that placed the unconscious at the center of our thoughts, drives, fantasies, and actions. Jung, who had already begun to push beyond the surface of symptoms in his clinical work, found in Freud a kind of lodestar, a language through which to speak about inner life in a manner that could be shared, discussed, debated, and tested. The meeting in Vienna in 1907 did more than pair two minds. It launched a collaborative project that would shift the center of gravity in modern psychology. If Freud was the father of psychoanalysis, Jung's early work would help expand the family's reach, pushing beyond the narrow frame of drive and conflict toward a broader anthropology of the psyche. The collaboration was not merely an exchange of technique, it was a strategic marriage of two intuitions, each of which could illuminate the other's blind spots. Jung would bring questions about myth, symbol, religion, and culture into the fold of psychoanalytic inquiry, insisting that the psyche could not be understood by the mere calculus of urges and resistances. It is important to pause and listen to what this collaboration achieved and what it could not hold together. Jung did not simply echo Freud, he extended and at times contested Freud's assumptions. In the early years, Jung helped push psychoanalysis beyond the Freudian frame by insisting that the unconscious was not just a repository of drives to be minimized or explained, but a living, organized field of psychic life. He argued that human experience contains patterns, archetypes, that are inherited and shared across humanity, shaping dreams, myths, and religious symbols in ways that cannot be reduced to individual life history. This, in essence, was one of Jung's first major contributions, a widening of the concept of the unconscious from a reservoir of sexual drives to a vast, intersubjective landscape in which images, motifs, and narratives could emerge across cultures and epochs. The early period of Jung's collaboration with Freud gave rise to a burgeoning sense that psychology could be both scientific and expansive, intimate and universal. The two men spoke with a shared language about the psyche's depths, but they also began to diverge in important ways. Jung's clinical experience in Basel and Zurich, his study of dreams, and his interest in myth and religion made him more receptive to symbolic forms as real forces in patients' lives. Freud, though not indifferent to symbolic life, remained anchored in a theory of drives, a dynamic of internal conflict, and a therapeutic protocol aimed at making the unconscious conscious through interpretation of dreams and free association. The tension between the two economies, drive theory and symbol theory, inevitably led to recalibration. That recalibration was not orderly. It carried with it a crisis, the very hinge of Jung's trajectory. The break with Freud in 1913, born of theoretical differences that would become more than disagreements about technique. The most famous point of contention was over the nature of libido. For Freud, libido was primarily sexual energy, a courageous and limiting frame, to be sure, for it tied the entire life of the mind to sexuality as the primary engine. Jung began to push back against that frame. He argued for the concept of a broader psychic energy that could be invested in a variety of forms: creative, spiritual, cultural, symbolic, a reservoir not reducible to sexual motive. In the course of this dispute, the two men found themselves not merely disagreeing about details, but redefining what psychology could become. Jung's insistence on the independence of the psyche and the possibility that the mind could structure itself around archetypal patterns, shared images and motifs that appear across cultures, was a radical reorientation. The break culminated in 1913 and 1914, a period often described as Jung's crisis years. It was both personal and professional. Professionally, Jung found himself stepping away from Freud's orbit, moving toward a path that would eventually be recognized as analytical psychology, a distinct tradition with its own methods, vocabulary, and aims. Personally, Jung's inner life intensified in those years. He began to articulate, through intense inner work, a sense that the mind was not merely a passive repository of repressed wishes, but a dynamic, self-regulating system seeking wholeness through a process he would later call individuation. The crisis years, far from being merely a setback, became a crucible in which Jung's most enduring insights began to crystallize. The existence of a personal unconscious, the emergence of the collective unconscious, and the prioritization of the symbolic as a way of knowing the soul. During that same period, the cultural and scientific atmosphere surrounding Jung's work was thick with conflicting currents. The early 20th century was a time when the sciences of the mind, psychology, philosophy, anthropology, and literature were in conversation with one another, often in dissonant chords. The climate was saturated with a search for deeper meaning that did not yield easily to the logic of the laboratory. Philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche had already issued a powerful critique of conventional morality and rationalist claims about truth. Nietzsche's critique of morality, his insistence that moral codes are human constructs that can be questioned, inverted, or deconstructed, hung over European intellectual life as a challenge to complacency. In his magnum opus, Nietzsche hinted at a psychology of values that would, in different ways, resonate with Jung's later work on the moral shadow and the individuation process. The psychological terrain, then, was not solely clinical. It was an imaginative landscape in which literature, myth, philosophy, and anthropology all contributed to a more complex understanding of what it means to be human. If we turn to the broader field of myth and anthropology, Jung did not stand apart from these disciplines. He stood within a dialogue with them. He drew on anthropology's curiosity about other cultures, myths, rituals, and symbolic life, and brought those insights into clinical and theoretical work. He read across cultural borders: Greek myth, Hindu and Buddhist thought, Native American symbolism, Jungish-inspired readings of religious experience, and in doing so he intervened in the way psychology could attend to universals and particulars at once. He did not simply borrow, he reframed. Where earlier psychology had tended to see myths as outdated beliefs or lapses into symbolism, Jung read myth as a cognitive structure, as a living language through which the psyche communicates with itself and with others across centuries. The consequence was a theory that could account for dream images not as personal baggage alone, but as motifs that echo across time and space: the self, the shadow, the anima and animus, the persona. These terms, which would later become central to Jungian thought, were not arbitrary inventions but conceptual tools that grew out of a patient's dreams, a clinician's notes, and the arcing arc of Jung's own inner exploration. To understand how Jung's ideas moved from the therapy room into broader cultural life, consider a key anecdote from 1909, the Clark University visit. It is worth savoring in detail, not merely as a historical footnote, but as a moment when the public face of psychoanalysis crossed the Atlantic and entered American professional life. Freud and Jung traveled to Worcester, Massachusetts, to present psychoanalytic ideas to American psychologists and scholars. The occasion was a grand demonstration, with large audiences, a sense that something momentous had come into the room. The Clark University visit was a public synthesis of theory and experiment, a moment when Jung's energy and Freud's drive coalesced into a new form of intellectual drama. The American response was mixed. Some celebrated the boldness of a new science that dared to name the hidden depths of the mind. Others remained cautious, skeptical of a method that challenged the foundations of clinical practice and scientific control. Yet the visit left a lasting imprint. It seeded a generation of American psychologists mapping the unconscious, and it broadened the sense that the psyche was not simply a subject for psychiatrists in Vienna or Basel, but a field in which physicians, philosophers, and lay readers alike could find meaningful questions. 2 years after that climactic encounter with Freud in the United States, Jung encountered a different kind of turning point: the crisis years of 1913 and 1914. The break with Freud did not merely end a collaboration, it opened a new chapter in Jung's life and work. During this period, his introspective work accelerated, but not in the narrow sense of self-analysis. Rather, it became a public hermeneutics of the psyche, the careful, patient reading of inner images, of dreams and fantasies, of dialogues with figures that appeared to him in visions and nighttime visions, and of the symbolic life that seemed to recurse across cultures. In Jung's own light, those days were not simply a period of fragmentation. They were a period of reintegration of knowledge, an attempt to reassemble psychology around a more inclusive view of the soul's life. The crisis years are thus the hinge of his later work, the moment when he moved away from an exclusively analytic framework toward a broader mythology of the psyche that could accommodate both personal experience and collective patterns. The inner direction he began then would lead to the development of analytical psychology, the articulation of the collective unconscious, and the central idea of the archetype. But the story did not end there. If the Clark University visit marks one public milestone, there are other episodes that illuminate Jung's ongoing engagement with myth, dream, and the soul's imagery. One could point to his lifelong engagement with myth and dream analysis that would characterize much of his later work. Jung's attention to myth did not fade with his break from Freud, it deepened. He conducted a patient and, in a sense, a cross-cultural exploration of symbols, looking at how mythic motifs appear in dreams and fantasies, and how they can help a person navigate the path of individuation, the process by which a person becomes the unique person they are meant to be, integrated and whole. In this sense, Jung's life after the break is the story of a continued search for meaning in the symbolic language of the psyche. He read widely in world mythologies and religious traditions, noticing how similar images recur across different cultures. The wise old man, the hero, the maiden, the trickster, the great mother, and the shadow. He saw in those recurring patterns not mere allegory, but evidence of a psyche that shares its core architecture across humanity. His approach to clinical work grew more symbolic, more sensitive to the patient's inner world, and more attentive to the ways in which dreams could guide, correct, and mature a person's sense of self. Another significant anecdote in Jung's life, one that has become almost paradigmatic of his method and his devotion to inner work, concerns the Red Book, also known as Liber Novus. This is not a single moment, but a long, laborious period during which Jung ceased to rely only on clinical observation and external theory to interpret the mind. He turned inward with a seriousness that few colleagues would risk publicly. The Red Book, which he produced during the years 1913 to 1930, is a richly illustrated manuscript that records his inner dialogues with figures from his own unconscious, the figures who often appeared as teachers, demons, guides, and strange symbolic presences. It is a testament to Jung's belief that the psyche speaks in images, and that those images can be engaged with through conscious reflection, disciplined imagination, and creative writing. The Red Book is not merely a personal diary. It is, in a sense, a map of Jung's own individuation journey, showing how the psyche can become itself through the conscious labor of dialogue with its own contents. The work of interpretation that followed, how to translate those inner dialogues into terms that could illuminate a patient's life, was shaped in part by the very act of giving form to the images Jung encountered within. In this long arc, from Swiss upbringing to Basel's medical training, from the early fascination with dreams and myth to the crisp, sometimes contentious conversation with Freud, and then into the crisis years and the inward turn toward myth, symbol, and individuation, there are three concrete demonstrations of Jung's influence on psychology and culture. The first is his role as a collaborator who helped popularize the idea of the unconscious beyond Freud's drive-centered framework. The second is his development of psychological types and the still resonant distinction between introversion and extroversion. The third is his personal crisis around 1913, a turning point that precipitated foundational shifts in his theoretical stance and method. As a collaborator who helped popularize the broader concept of the unconscious, Jung stretched the boundaries of what could be considered part of the psychic life. He did not abandon the Freudian insight that there is a hidden dimension to mental life. Rather, he complemented it with a recognition that the unconscious is not a mere reservoir of repressed sexual content. Through his clinical work and his study of cultural artifacts, myths, dreams, religious symbols, he argued that the psyche possesses a structure that is common to humanity, a structure that can be glimpsed in the most intimate dreams and in the grand narratives of civilizations. The collective unconscious, with its archetypal forms, became a way to account for dreams that resonate across cultures, for mythic motifs that recur in disparate traditions, and for the experiences of individuals who feel that their inner life speaks in a language older than their own biography. In the course of this argument, Jung did not repudiate Freud. He redefined the scope of the unconscious so that it could contain both the personal history of an individual and the shared, ancestral patterns that inform the human psyche. The broader idea of the unconscious, as Jung shaped it, helped to popularize a more expansive, yet still rigorous, vision of what the mind could be. In the second concrete example, Jung's development of psychological types and the introversion-extroversion distinction has proven to be one of the most durable contributions to personality theory. The mid-20th century saw the elaboration of dimly lit corners of the psyche into a structured typology, and Jung's four psychological functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, provide a framework for understanding how people process information and experience the world. The attitudes of introversion and extroversion organize those functions around a basic orientation toward inner life or outward life. Think of the thinker who prefers to reason internally, or the sensor who trusts concrete data from the senses, or the intuitor who navigates by patterns and possibilities. The extrovert, by contrast, engages more readily with the outer world, seeking stimulation, connection, and tangible outcomes. Jung's typology does not reduce people to labels. It offers a map of differences that can illuminate educational choices, career decisions, and personal growth. It invites us to ask not simply whether we are enthusiastic or reserved, but how we tend to engage with thoughts, values, and sensory experiences, and how those tendencies shape our relationships with others and with our own inner life. The typology draws from clinical observations and cross-cultural reading, reflecting Jung's broader conviction that the psyche's structure is both deeply personal and universally patterned. It is a practical tool that has found its way into counseling, organizational theory, and even popular culture, while remaining a contested and evolving theory within psychology. The third concrete example, the personal crisis around 1913, shows how a crisis can act as a catalyst for transformative theory. Jung's break with Freud did not represent a betrayal of the project of understanding the mind. It signaled a reorientation of that project toward a more expansive, mythic, and symbolic account of inner life. The crisis years, 1913 and 1914, marked the moment when Jung began to articulate a more plural, more dialogic vision of the psyche. He insisted that the mind's energies could not be fully grasped by a political cum diagnostic framework that saw the unconscious only as repository of repressed sexual content. The inner life, he argued, contains not only personal memories, but images that predate the person's birth and culture, accrued across generations. This turn toward a symbolic and mythic dimension was not an abandonment of science. It was an expansion of the scientific horizon to include what could be gathered from dreams, visions, art, and world myth. The crisis produced a new vocabulary and a new sense of clinical practice. Psychology as an art of listening to the psyche's images and helping patients to recognize and integrate their own inner meanings rather than simply eliminating symptoms. The Red Book, the inner dialogues, and the patient exploration that followed can be seen as the material infrastructure of this reorientation. Not a rejection of psychotherapy, but a reimagining of what psychotherapy could aim at: individuation, wholeness, and a return to a self that can inhabit the wholeness of its own story. Jung's life and work did not emerge in isolation from the philosophical and cultural currents around him. The relationship with Freud, the influence of Nietzsche, and the wider currents of myth and anthropology show that Jung's project was both continuation and rupture, a conversation with and against the dominant ideas of his day. Freud's psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on unconscious mechanisms and symbolic interpretation, provided a vocabulary and a method, but Jung's insistence on the multiplicity of unconscious content and the possibility that symbols carry meaning across the person and the culture pushed back against a reductive moral psychology and a strictly drive-based theory. Nietzsche's critique of morality, with its insistence that moral codes are contingent human constructs rather than universal absolutes, offered Jung a language for thinking about the shadow, the moral complex, and the tension between cultural norms and inner life. The idea that the psyche is not simply a theater of conflict between opposing forces, but a living system with meaningful patterns, is very much in dialogue with Nietzsche, even as Jung's emphasis on the transformative potential of the psyche's symbolic life marks a departure from Nietzsche's more radical critique of the moral order. The broader field of myth and anthropology also casts light on Jung's project. Jung did not simply borrow ideas from Frazer or other anthropologists, he reframed them within a clinical and developmental perspective. He saw myth not as primitive superstition, but as a repertoire of human cognition that has been performed in countless shapes across cultures. The recurring motifs, death and rebirth, the hero's journey, the eternal feminine, the wise old man, are not mere literary devices. They are, in Jung's view, windows into how the psyche organizes experience and learns to navigate the complexities of life. This is where Jung both dialogues with and diverges from the traditions of myth and anthropology. He accepts their evidence that human beings share a symbolic life, yet he claims that this life is not simply cultural or historical but structural, a universal architecture by which the psyche can come to know itself and its path toward wholeness. To this day, Jung's life and thought invite us to reflect on how a single biographical arc can illuminate a broader philosophical inquiry. The Swiss upbringing that seeded respect for rigor and meaning, the medical training that trained him to observe, the dream-filled imagination that invited images to speak, and the dramatic turning point of the Freud-Jung collaboration and its subsequent fracturing. All of these threads converge into a picture of a thinker who refused to let psychology be reduced to a single jargon or a single method. He insisted that the mind's deepest truths cannot be confined to a laboratory's precise measurements alone, nor to a single interpretive language. They require openness to symbol, to myth, to inner imagery, as well as to careful clinical technique, to the patient's narrative, and to cross-cultural patterns that reveal a shared human life. Thus, this life and intellectual context segment does more than recount events. It invites you to sense the atmosphere in which Jung learned to listen for how images arise in dreams, how cultures weep and laugh through shared symbols, and how a mind might be changed by the acknowledgement that there are parts of ourselves we do not control, parts that carry the memory of humanity itself. It invites us to see the mind as a field where science and symbol bifurcate into a single, living inquiry about the nature of being. In the next segment, we will continue this exploration by moving from Jung's personal arc into a closer look at the key intellectual influences that shaped his early ideas: Sigmund Freud, Nietzsche, anthropology, literature, and the broader currents of philosophy, and we will begin to map how these influences performed a dialogue with Jung's own experiences, guiding him toward a theory that would redefine psychology as a science that also speaks the language of myth and symbol. Let us settle into the texture of the mind that Jung invites us to inhabit. Not a single uniform thing, but a living drama, a layered architecture where a surface you might call the ego peels back to reveal deeper strata, laterally connected through time to the oldest motifs of humanity. In Jung's account, the psyche is not just a private theater of thoughts and feelings. It is a vast, stratified field in which conscious life navigates, learns, and grows through encounters with what lies beneath awareness. To orient ourselves, imagine stepping into a cavern where light from a distant entrance barely reaches the walls. What you see directly is your conscious ego, the small, alert you who identifies, decides, and acts in the world. Beyond the edge of light, there are corridors and chambers, each colder and older, each filled with echoes. Those are the personal and collective unconscious, and they are not mere storage spaces. They are active, shaping forces that influence what you think, feel, and choose, often before you know you are being influenced at all. Let's begin with the architecture Jung names the conscious ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. The conscious ego, in Jung's language, is the focal center of a person's sense of self in a given moment. It holds the current thoughts, the plans, the judgments, and the explicit beliefs you can name. The ego is the seat of your will as you experience it in the daylight of daily life, but no one lives there alone. Behind and beneath is the personal unconscious, a repository of experiences that have fallen out of waking awareness, memories that may have been forgotten, traumatic impressions that have receded, and patterns of perception that have become automatic or defensive. These are not random recollections. They are organized, shaped by past life events, influenced by complexes, clusters of emotion, memory, and meaning that cling to particular themes, often around figures from one's early life. Then there is the collective unconscious, a layer Jung insisted lies beyond the personal history you carry. It is not your private cellar, but a shared reservoir of psychic material inherited from our ancestors. It contains the archetypes, those universal patterns of image and energy that appear across cultures and ages, found in dreams, myths, and ritual as if they come with a deep, almost pre-programmed, sense of what is meaningful. The collective unconscious is not something you learned from parents or education. It is something you inherit as a member of the human species. You might feel at times that a theme in your dream, say, a wise old man or a journey through a dark forest, arrives as if it had always been waiting in your own mind, waiting to be recognized, not invented. That is Jung's claim. There are motifs too old and universal to be traced to a single personal origin. Now, within this architecture, there are four fundamental functions through which the psyche engages the world: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. These are not simply different mental processes. They are nervous system orientations toward what counts as data in the world, toward what invites response, and toward how a person experiences meaning. Thinking tends to render things as objects of analysis, to seek coherence and truth through logic. Feeling, though, evaluates things in terms of their value and significance for the person who feels. Sensation registers the present moment through the senses, giving us the texture and concreteness of experience. Intuition operates more like a reconnaissance system, tracking possibilities, patterns, and hunches about what might lie ahead or what might be connected beneath the surface. Each of us has a dominant mode, and each of us relies on all four to some degree. The drama, however, arises as the psyche struggles to balance and integrate these functions, especially when one or more have become rigid or overdeveloped. The drama of individuation, then, is the lifelong journey toward a more complete, more conscious self. Individuation is not a one-time achievement. It is a process by which the psyche seeks to realize its potential for wholeness by reconciling inner opposites. It is the movement by which the ego learns to live with the contents of the unconscious rather than pretend those contents do not exist. It is a term Jung uses to describe the emergence of a stable, self-directed center, the self, that can coordinate the psyche's many parts. The self is not the mere ego extended. It is a governing archetype that underwrites order, meaning, and harmony within the psyche. It is the inner compass that can reconcile contradictory impulses, align inner and outer life, and steer the person toward a fulfilled, authentic life. To understand the structure more vividly, we should turn to the four archetypal forms that act on the interior stage: the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self. Each of these is not simply a stereotype or a caricature. Each is a living symbolic energy that can be experienced, projected, and integrated. The persona is the public face, the social mask we adopt to fit into roles, whether in the family, at work, or in broader society. The shadow is the disowned or disfavored side of ourselves, the traits we shrug off or deny. The anima and the animus are the inner feminine and inner masculine principles present in all individuals, which shape our relationships, our desires, and our creative impulse. The self stands at the heart of the system as the center that orders opposites and bears the potential for a unified life. Together, these elements map a dynamic living psyche rather than a static portrait. Let us step into each of these figures with concrete lived scenarios. We will begin with the persona, for the social mask is perhaps the most immediately recognizable feature of everyday life. Consider three scenes that illuminate how the persona operates, how it protects and shields, and how it can both serve and distort. First scenario, a job interview. You are asked to present not only your skills, but a version of yourself the company wants to meet. You rehearse talking points, tailor stories, and choose a wardrobe that signals professionalism and compatibility. The mask is not deceit so much as a necessary instrument in a social economy that rewards certain appearances. The persona here keeps the self coherent in a situation that demands presentation, but it can also obscure genuine emotion. If you notice that anxiety is amplified whenever you talk about yourself, or that you feel alienated from parts of your own history you're tempted to omit, you are experiencing the tensions that the persona creates between true self and social expectation. The more keenly you feel a dissonance between inner reality and outward performance, the clearer it becomes that the social mask is a tool that must be examined and ultimately integrated into a larger sense of self rather than reserved for the stage. Second scenario, the social media profile. In a modern mirror held up to the psyche, the persona is curated, edited, and polished. We present a version of ourselves that maximizes likes and fosters an identity that feels coherent with a particular online audience. The mask expands beyond a single moment into a daily ritual of presentation. The posts chosen, the captions crafted, the images filtered, these become a theater in which the self rehearses its preferred version of reality. When someone experiences a sudden, jarring sense of inauthenticity, when a post collects more approval than a real inner experience would warrant, we see the shadow stirring at the edge of the platform's glow. The persona here is not wholly false, it is a necessary social instrument. But Jung would remind us that if the mask becomes the only face we have, or if we cannot recognize what the mask covers, the psyche loses its opportunity for genuine growth. The integration of persona with a more authentic inner life becomes the task. Third scenario, a family gathering steeped in old patterns. You step into a role that your family expects, perhaps the responsible child, the calm elder, the peacemaker, an expected persona that stabilizes the scene. Yet under the mask there can be tension, resentment, or unspoken desires. Each time you slip into or out of the mask, you reveal a line of energy that travels from the conscious into the unconscious. In moments when you let the mask waver, you might discover traits that you had disowned, a stubborn impulse, a desire for recognition, or a need to defend yourself. The family setting, with its long history and recurring scripts, offers a natural laboratory for testing the limits of the persona. The more aware you become of the mask's boundaries, the more you learn to negotiate between role, self, and relationship. This is where Jung's idea of individuation begins to show its practical face. The mask serves a function, but the psyche seeks a balance that allows genuine self-expression to emerge in relation to others. Now, let us turn to the shadow. The shadow is not merely evil or dangerous. It is the unacknowledged portion of the psyche that carries energy, impulse, and potential that the ego has labeled unacceptable. The shadow often manifests as a hidden counterpart to shows of light, unwanted traits, projections, and instincts that we deny in ourselves and project onto others. Jung's formulation asks us first to recognize that the shadow exists, and second, to bring it into the light of awareness so that it can be integrated rather than repressed. The following three scenarios illustrate how the shadow speaks in different registers: in dreams, in literature as projection that asks for integration, and in the moral economy of the everyday. First scenario: a dream of being chased by a dark figure. In the dream, you are running through a labyrinth of corridors that seem to lead nowhere. The figure behind you never speaks, but its presence is suffocating, close enough to touch, yet always just beyond reach. When you awaken, you feel a mixture of fear, shame, and relief. Jung would interpret such a dream as a confrontation with parts of yourself you have not owned, perhaps aggressiveness, insecurity, or a buried anger. The chase in the dream is not random. It signals that certain contents of the unconscious are moving toward consciousness, and the psyche is urging you to stop running and to meet what you have refused to accept. If you tell yourself after waking that you would never act like the shadow in waking life, you may be in denial. The dream is a language of the shadow, and the prompt to integrate is a gift from the unconscious telling you that the energy you fear is energy you can transform rather than disown. Second scenario: a piece of literature in which a beloved character reveals a ruthless, vindictive streak. You might read a scene in which a hero is confronted with an unforgiven grievance and discovers in themselves the capacity to do harm. The shadow enters literature as a mirror within a mirror. The antagonist is not merely an external obstacle, but a reflection of an element of the self cast outside. The moment of projection, when you feel disgust or fear toward a character who embodies traits you recognize in yourself, offers an invitation to integration. In Jungian terms, to become conscious of the shadow is to widen the circle of what you consider human, to resist the pull of moral self-righteousness, and to embrace the possibility that your own capacity for harm contains the seed of restraint, compassion, and choice. In a therapeutic frame, such a reading becomes a guide for recognizing how one's own unlived energies shape judgments and antagonisms in daily life. Third scenario: the friction of a close relationship in which a partner's assertiveness or independence triggers your own envy or fear of loss. The shadow here is intimate and personal. You may notice yourself responding with snappish criticisms or with withdrawal that feels disproportionate to the situation. Rather than accusing the other person of being the problem, Jung's invitation is to notice what the reaction reveals about your own unowned qualities. The shadow reveals itself in relationships as bluntly as in dreams because the intimate space makes the unconscious contents more accessible. The progression toward integration involves acknowledging the shadow's charge, exploring its sources, perhaps a fear of inadequacy, a longing for control, or a buried wish for validation, and then choosing a response that aligns with a more conscious, adult stance. By inviting the shadow to speak, you discover a form of power that is not domination or denial, but self-mastery and empathy. An anima or animus appears in our inner life as the counterpole to the everyday masculine or feminine persona. The anima in a man and the animus in a woman are not merely fantasies thrown up by the psyche. They are living energies shaping how we relate to the other half of humanity inside us and how we engage with people in the outer world, especially in romantic partnerships and in creative endeavor. The following 3 scenarios illuminate how this inner partner surfaces, often in subtle, surprising ways, through relationships, through creative work, and through inner dialogue that reorganizes perception. First scenario. In a relationship, a man might find that his emotional responsiveness or receptivity to vulnerability is shaped by his anima. He may notice that episodes of deep empathy or tenderness arise not from analytic thinking, but from a sense that a feminine inner figure is guiding his perception, an inner voice that helps him to listen, to pause, to be present with someone else's pain. This does not mean surrendering autonomy. Rather, it means recognizing a personal inner partner guiding the way one experiences relationship. In Jung's language, the anima can ground a more relational form of masculinity, one that does not fear feeling, but learns to translate feeling into action that respects the other's subjectivity. Second scenario, a woman who experiences the animus as a counterforce that clarifies her judgments and sharpens her creative energy. An animus in a woman can appear as a reliable critic that pushes her to make ideas precise, to defend a position against complacency, or to challenge assumptions that would otherwise remain unexamined. In the arena of romance, the inner animus can manifest as a projecting partner who embodies the traits of masculine energy, drive, decisiveness, or protective expectation. But the work of individuation invites re-engagement with that energy in a way that respects both inner life and outer life, letting the animus become a resource rather than a constraint. Third scenario. In creative work, the anima/animus pair can appear as a living duet, guiding how art or writing unfolds. The artist might sense that a character or voice inside, an inner partner who is not merely the author but a co-creator, helps shape the tone, the rhythm, and the moral posture of a project. A painter might feel the anima as a visual invitation to color and form that speak to a longing for integration, while a writer might experience the animus as a critical energy that compels clarity and coherence. The inner partner becomes an ally in the act of creation, inviting a more deeply felt, more psychologically resonant product. Fourth scenario. In relational life outside romance, the anima/animus helps clarify how we relate to friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Suppose you are presenting an idea in a group setting and feel both attraction and defensiveness toward a particular viewpoint. An animated inner figure might arise that reframes your perspective, offering a more generous, imaginative stance that still honors your integrity. The anima/animus then becomes a bridge between inner life and outer life, a catalyzer for empathy, insight, and connection, rather than a source of projection that distances you from others. The self, finally, is the central governing archetype, the unifying force that orders opposites and holds together the life of the psyche. If the persona is the mask we wear in the social arena, the shadow is the disowned energy that haunts or destabilizes us, and the anima or animus is the inner partner shaping relation and creativity. The self is the larger coordinate system that makes sense of all these movements. The self is not simply an ideal, it is experienced as a sense of inner wholeness, a felt awareness that the psyche has its own laws and teleology. Many readers report times in life when, after a period of confusion, a sense of direction appears, an inner turning toward a form of coherence that makes sense of disparate parts and gives energy to the will to grow. This is Jung's image of the self as the guiding center that orders opposites and integrates the personal with the collective, the conscious with the unconscious, the familiar with the unknown. Let me give you 3 scenarios that illuminate the self's function in everyday life, as a governing center that orders the psyche's drama rather than a distant ideal that we merely admire from afar. First scenario. A crisis that forces you to choose between competing values. You stand at a crossroad where honesty and loyalty pull you in different directions. You experience a clash of inner voices, one urging you to tell the truth even if it costs you, another urging you to protect someone you care about. The self emerges as the governing center that recognizes the need to balance integrity with compassion, to consider both the demand of reality and the shape of your own life story. The self does not demand that you erase conflict. It invites you to restore wholeness in its wake, to reorder your priorities in light of a more inclusive sense of who you are becoming. Second scenario, an inner process that leads to a symbolic turning point, perhaps a dream sequence that repeats with new imagery, evolving toward a mandala-like form, a circle of unity that includes opposites. Jung often used the symbol of the mandala to describe the self's activity, a circle with a center, a sign of totality and unity. In such moments, the self seems to say, in effect, this is not merely about solving a problem, but about reconfiguring your entire orientation to life. The experience can feel both spiritual and psychological, offering not only resolution, but a transformation of how you inhabit time, space, and intention. Third scenario, a creative or intellectual life that begins to integrate disparate strands, reason and imagination, science and myth, personal history and collective symbol. The self's governance is felt as a new coherence, a sense that the different themes of your life can be held together without dissolving into contradiction. The aesthetic, ethical, and existential issues that once seemed apart begin to inform one another, and a new sense of purpose emerges that is both whole and open to surprise. The self in this sense acts as an interior governor, a compass that invites you to become more fully yourself through the ongoing work of integration. To deepen the conversation, let us place Jung's ideas in dialogue with others, beginning with Freud, the forebear and sometimes rival in the field of the unconscious. Freud's theory of the unconscious, with its emphasis on repressed wishes, drives behind symptoms, and the structural model of the id, ego, and superego, provides a kind of grammar for inner life, but Jung's version expands the map. Where Freud emphasizes the personal, often conflict-driven energy of desire and defense, Jung emphasizes not only personal history, but the shared, archetypal structures that seem to outlive a single life. The Freudian unconscious is a theater of tension among instinct, reality, and conscience. Jung's unconscious includes a source of meaning beyond personal history, a storehouse of images that speak to the whole species. The two accounts can be read as complementary in a sense, with Jung insisting that even our most personal content is touched by something larger than ourselves, a shape that we did not choose but that calls us to respond. Within this dialogue, Jung also invites us to recognize a thread that runs through many spiritual and philosophical traditions. The claim that life is not only a sequence of isolated events, but a drama in which deeper patterns organize experience. The mythic dimension in Jung's psychology aligns with existential questions about authenticity, responsibility, and the search for meaning. When we encounter authenticity in existential thought, we are dealing with a life that is lived in accordance with one's true self, not merely the social mask or the inherited pattern. The existential challenge is to face the self with honesty, to accept the burden of freedom, and to enact choices that are true to one's being. In Jung's framework, authenticity arises not simply from being true to yourself as a one-off moment, but from a lifelong engagement with the inner figures, the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self, that shape who you are and who you will become. And what about the universality of archetypes, the counterargument many scholars raise? Critics ask whether the claim that such motifs recur across diverse cultures is a sign of universal human nature or simply the universality of storytelling, the projection of a shared human experience into mythic form. Jung's response is not to insist that archetypes are identical across cultures in their outward forms, but to argue that the underlying energy, patterns for experiencing and expressing life, has a kind of primordial basis. These patterns can express themselves in various symbols, rituals, and stories depending on historical, cultural, and personal context. The archetypes are not rigid molds, they are living motifs that flex but do not disappear. The counterargument, validation through cross-cultural comparison, becomes, in Jung's hands, a kind of evidence, not proof in a laboratory sense, but a form of phenomenological alignment. Similar images arise in dreams and myths across time and space, and these resonances point to something real in the psychic constitution of humanity. A second critique concerns the empirical status of the collective unconscious. How can scientists test something that is, by its very nature, not directly observable, and that claims to be inherited across generations? Jung's answer is not to surrender to external verification alone, but to cultivate a clinical science of the psyche, one that looks at the healing and growth that occur when individuals become conscious of their own inner patterns. He argued that archetypal patterns manifest in dreams and in the symbolic language of art and culture. If a dream or a work of literature repeatedly evokes the same motifs, it is not merely a matter of cultural influence. It is a reflection of an enduring psychic structure that operates in many minds independent of any single observer. He also introduced the idea of synchronistic experience, the meaningful coincidence of events that are not causally connected, as a way of indicating that the psyche and the world intersect in ways that conventional science struggles to accommodate. In Jung's account, the psyche has its own laws, and many of these laws reveal themselves in the form of symbol, myth, and symbolical action, rather than in straightforward cause and effect experiments. These debates about evidence, universality, and method are not merely academic. They touch the core of how we understand mind, culture, and spirituality. Jung's project was never to dethrone science or to replace it with myth, but to widen the lens through which we view the human condition. He believed that the psyche is a living, self-creating system, and that meaningful growth involves engaging with its oldest energies as well as its newest discoveries. That is the sense in which his psychology remains relevant for our times. It invites us to listen more carefully to the dreams we have, to the patterns that recur in our lives, and to the myths that shape our stories. If we turn outward from Jung's own system and connect to broader streams of thought, we find resonances and contrasts that illuminate the depth of what Jung was doing. Freud's theory of the unconscious and repression gives us the core mechanism by which hidden content leaks into conscious life. Jung's archetypes add a dimension that is more universal, more mythic, and more symbolic, an emphasis on patterns that feel larger than any single life. Existential philosophy adds the claim that authenticity is a constant task of choosing to live in accordance with one's own nature, rather than simply adhering to roles or inherited expectations. The existential insistence on freedom, responsibility, and becoming invites a Jungian psychology to see freedom not as the elimination of constraints, but as the courageous act of recognizing and integrating all that emerges from within. In Jung's vocabulary, authenticity is not merely a self-discovery, but a courageous alignment with the self's governance that orders the psyche toward wholeness. If we broaden the frame further to cross-cultural theory, the parallels with mythic and religious thought become striking. Mircea Eliade's insistence that mythic structures organize human experience and reveal itself through hierophanies, moments of the sacred revealing itself in the ordinary world, speaks to Jung's sense that archetypal energies surface in dreams, rituals, and creative artifacts. The idea is that myth and symbol are not mere cultural ornaments, but expressions of enduring patterns of life, death, transformation, and rebirth that all humans share. Joseph Campbell's famous assertion that myths are public dreams and dreams are private myths offers a practical way to see how Jung's idea of the collective unconscious operates in an accessible, narrative register. If a dream or a myth resonates across cultures, perhaps it has tapped into a common human experience, a shared psychic grammar for understanding the drama of life. Campbell's monomyth, The Hero's Journey, maps the arc of transformation that many people experience in their own lives, a narrative pattern that echoes the individuation process Jung describes, in which a person meets callings, trials, mentors, revelations, and then receives a transformed sense of self and purpose. We have walked through the architecture of Jungian psychology and traced it through the lives of key archetypes and the life story of individuation. But a map is not the land, and the land is not merely a collection of signs. The real test of Jung's ideas lies in how they illuminate lived experience, in how they guide people toward greater wholeness, and in how they offer a language for the experience that is often unsayable. The sense that there is more to us than a bundle of memories and motives, that there exists an inner center, a unity, a mythic pattern that can keep us oriented when life grows complicated, and that invites us to become more fully who we are. To close, let us hear a few lines that crystallize Jung's own stance, in the voice of primary sources, and then consider how these lines echo across time and culture. Consider the idea that the self is not merely a goal but a governing principle. In Jung's words, the self can be described as the center and circumference of the psyche, the place where the opposites meet and are reconciled, the source of meaning that orders the many voices within. The self in this sense becomes a living guide, not a distant ideal. And yet Jung does not present the self as a tyrant or a fixed fate. It is a dynamic center that grows as you grow, that invites you to encounter your own darkness, and that offers the promise of a life integrated with the world's living symbol system. If we return to Freud's fundamental insight, where id was, there shall ego be, we recognize the still present tension between instinct and insight, between unexamined energy and reflective life. Jung's vision continues that inquiry by asking not only what we repress or desire, but what patterns, archetypes, reside in the human heart as a common inheritance. The psychoanalytic conversation is enlarged by Jung's contribution, and the existential debate is enriched by his insistence that authenticity is not a momentary declaration, but a continuous discipline of listening, facing, and transforming what you discover inside. And if we widen the lens to myth and narrative, Jung's psychology becomes a bridge to the language of mythic resonance. Mircea Eliade teaches us to listen for hierophanies, moments when the sacred enters ordinary space. Joseph Campbell teaches us to read myths as maps of the inner journey, the hero's voyage from ignorance to wholeness. In Jung's hands, the psyche's architecture of persona, shadow, anima or animus, and self ties together the individual's inner world with the perennial stories that have animated human beings across millennia. The human life in this framing becomes a pilgrimage toward something larger than itself, an ongoing effort to translate the private language of dreams and feelings into the universal language of meaning that can be lived, shared, and cherished. As you reflect on these ideas, you might ask yourself, what are the masks you wear in different settings, and what would it take to bring them into a more honest synthesis with your inner life? Where does fear of your own shadow show up in your daily judgments, friendships, or work, and how could you invite that energy to teach you rather than dominate you? In what ways does your inner partner, the anima or animus, speak through your relationships or your creative projects, nudging you toward a mode of living that is both true to you and open to others? And what would it mean for you to discover a self that does not merely direct from above, but includes you within a larger circle of meaning? A center that allows you to hold opposites together, to move through life with a sense of direction that is not coercive but inviting. If you listen closely to Jung's call, you hear a path that does not abolish suffering but redeems it through insight, a path that does not deny fantasy or myth but grounds them in a disciplined, humane, and open-ended inquiry. It is a path that invites dialogue with Freud and with existentialist thinkers, with mythic thinkers like Campbell and Eliade, and with those who seek a deeper understanding of their own lives. The path invites you to become not a finished object, but a continually becoming subject, a person who knows that the psyche's deepest energies are not only private, but part of a shared human heritage. We began with the cave and the light beyond it, the conscious ego at the center, the personal unconscious behind, the collective unconscious stretching into the oldest wells of human experience. We have walked through the four functions, seen how they shape our perception and choice, and traced how the drama of individuation unfolds as the self orders the psyche, bringing the disparate parts into a more living harmony. We have watched the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self interact in three powerful, concrete scenarios for each, and we have heard the human history that underpins these ideas, Jung's own life. His alliance and rupture with Freud, the crisis of 1913-1914 that reshaped his thinking, and the subsequent development of psychological types and individuation in the 1920s and 1930s. We have also opened the door to critique and defense, the empirical questions about the collective unconscious, the universality of archetypes, and Jung's own responses that guided his later formulations, as well as the continuing conversations with Freud, existentialists, and mythic thinkers. The result, perhaps, is a map not of a closed theory but of a living invitation, to see the mind as a landscape where light and shadow, pattern and surprise, the individual and the mythic continually negotiate to reveal a fuller, truer self. If you carry one idea forward from this section, let it be this. Jung's psychology asks you to take seriously the inner life that you have often learned to neglect. It asks you to notice the masks you wear, to attend to the energies you have disowned, to hear the inner partner who might be shaping your motives without your full awareness, and to recognize a center within you capable of ordering the many voices into a life of greater coherence. It asks you to consider that your life is not merely a tale of personal preferences and social roles, but a narrative threaded through with archetypal themes that have spoken to human beings across time. And in paying attention to these threads, you may not only know yourself more clearly, but move toward a form of life that feels more alive, more honest, and more deeply connected to others and to the world. As we leave this exploration of core concepts, remember that Jung invites us into a discipline of mindful attention, to observe the images that arise in dreams, to listen to dreams' symbolic language, to notice how the social mask operates in daily life, to discern the shadow's lessons, to recognize the inner figures who shape relational life, and to honor the self's call to wholeness. The journey of individuation is not a destination but a practice, a way of living that keeps turning, keeps questioning, and keeps opening to a larger sense of what it means to be human. If you carry that practice into your days, you carry a piece of Jung's own lifelong labor, a patient love for the complexity of the psyche, and a patient, hopeful faith that, with attention, the mind can become more integrated, more compassionate, and more awake to the mystery that resides within. Let us step into a quiet room where the walls are lined not with clocks or pictures, but with the patient patterns of the human mind. Think of Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious as a map of the air that surrounds us. Subtle currents that we breathe in, often without realizing we are inhaling. These are not mere stories we tell ourselves to feel brave or to comfort the dark. They are the deep structures through which dreams, myths, art, and even ordinary daily life take shape. They are the shapes our minds turn to when a dawn mist lifts, when a dream lingers on the edge of waking, when a mythic image resurfaces in a novel, a film, or a prayer whispered in a quiet church. They are not strict laws like arithmetic, but they are reliable patterns, the kind of patterns that recur, not because human beings imitate one another mechanically, but because there is something shared, something ancestral about the way we experience the world. To begin with the core, what Jung called the archetypes, he argued that there is a layer of the psyche that is not rooted in personal experience alone, but in something more ancient and collective. That layer he named the collective unconscious. It is not the same as the personal unconscious, the repository of one's forgotten memories, own traumas, snapshots of one's private life. The collective unconscious runs deeper. It is the very architecture through which our more individualized experiences are interpreted. It is the soil in which the personal dream seeds germinate. The archetypes in Jung's telling are the psychic patterns that organize those seeds, the blueprints that shape the form of our experiences, even before we have a personal memory of their being organized that way. What then is an archetype? In Jung's vocabulary, archetypes are not empirical things you can point to in a lab. They are predispositions or tendencies to perceive, think, and feel a certain way when confronted with particular kinds of situations. They are the images or forms that appear across cultures and through time, patterns that recur because they resonate with something universal in the human predicament. They are, in Jung's phrase, the psychic equivalents of instinct, or perhaps the way instinct takes on symbol when it seeks expression beyond raw biology. An archetype is a tendency to respond in a certain symbolic way when the nervous system is faced with, say, a crisis, a question of identity, a boundary, a danger, a potential leap toward growth. And yet archetypes aren't rigid, they are dynamic, capable of being transformed as the person or the culture evolves. Now, Jung's own taxonomy of archetypes is a set of major figures that recur across dreams, myths, literature, and religious symbols. There are the self, the central organizing principle of the psyche, the shadow, that aspect of the personality that contains what we deny or disown, the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and inner masculine in women. And the persona, the mask we wear in social settings, the face presented to the outside world. Then there are commonly discussed figures, mother, trickster, and wise old man, each carrying a constellation of meanings that can appear in various cultures in different shapes but with a core resonance. Let us now turn to each of these archetypes in more vivid relief, not as dry definitions, but as living presences that show up in the narratives we tell ourselves about who we are and what the world asks of us. The self, as Jung defines it, is not simply the ego or the conscious mind. It is larger, more inclusive. It is the image of wholeness, the center and circumference of the psyche, as if the psyche is a circle and the self is the line that runs through that circle, both center and perimeter, always inviting us toward a more complete alignment of our inner dispositions with our outer existence. The self is the goal of individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process by which a person becomes more themselves, more aware of the totality of their psychic life, including both light and shadow, dream and waking, personal history and ancestral history. The self may appear in dreams as a mandala, or as a divine figure, or as a luminous point at the horizon. It may emerge in the encounter with a symbol that seems to carry more weight than any one personal narrative could bear. The self is not a person, it is a relation to one's own depth. The shadow is the other side of the self, perhaps even the more feared or repressed side. It contains the instincts and impulses the conscious mind disowns or labels as unacceptable. Aggression, appetite, fear, shame, or desire that society has not taught us to honor. The shadow is not simply evil. It is a reservoir, if acknowledged and engaged with honesty, of energy, creativity, and truth that refuses to be banished. To deny the shadow is to risk its power to erupt in uncontrolled ways. To confront the shadow is to invite a transformation, for Jung believed that by meeting the darker aspects of oneself, one discovers vitality and an opportunity to realign one's life with a more profound center. The shadow is a teacher when approached with humility. It is a potential pitfall when projected onto others and treated as a separate enemy. The anima and animus are the interior counterparts to the gendered dimensions of the psyche. The anima is the inner feminine in the male psyche, the image of what the male person longs to understand, to be guided by, or to balance within himself. The animus is the inner masculine in the female psyche, the image of masculine energy that shapes the woman's inner dialogue and judgments about authority, reason, and independence. These archetypes are not about reducing gender to a single essence. They are about the way each person carries inside a spectrum of feminine and masculine energies, often expressed in dreams as companions or mentors, sometimes as opponents or challengers. The anima might appear as a maiden in distress, a wise female figure, or a saintly presence. The animus might appear as a wise elder, a scientist, or a warrior. They are both guides to a more integrated sense of self, inviting the person to relate to the other half within. The persona is the mask we wear, the outward identity that helps us function in social life. It is not simply deception. It is a necessary compromise between the inner life and the demands of the outer world. The persona helps us fit into families, workplaces, communities, and cultures. It can be a brittle shield, a social costume that hides vulnerabilities, a compromise that enables trust and cooperation. Yet the danger of over-identifying with the persona is that it can become a false self, a polished surface that no longer corresponds to the deeper person within. The medicine, then, is not to discard the persona, but to keep it in its proper place. A tool for living that must be balanced by the ongoing work of the self, by an honest conversation with the shadow and the anima or animus. The mother archetype, commonly discussed, carries an even more variegated field of meanings. Maternal images appear as the great nurturing earth, as the earth mother, the goddess of fertility and safety. They appear as the mother figure in myth who both sustains and sometimes devours, offering protection but also testing the limits of a child's autonomy. In literature and film, the mother archetype can manifest as the source of life and warmth, or as a haunting, overbearing presence that asks to be obeyed or that absorbs the energy of those around her. The archetypal mother is not simply about maternal biology. She is the symbol of the primal relationship we have with nurture, safety, dependence, and the possibility of a separate self emerging from the womb of care. The archetype complicates as well as consoles. It is both a sanctuary and a potential trap if the enclosing love becomes all-consuming, or if the image becomes a projection that hinders the growth of the individual. The trickster, a figure that travels across continents and centuries, punctures the solemnities of life with mischief, cunning, and a sly gravity. Across the Atlantic and across the oldest fairy tales, the trickster appears as a shape-shifter who overturns the ordinary order, testing rules, exposing hypocrisy, and revealing that there are hidden tensions behind appearances. Anansi, the spider of West African and Caribbean folklore, embodies the trickster's wit and resourcefulness. Loki of the Norse mythos embodies the volatile disruption of cosmic balance. And Coyote in many North American indigenous myths embodies the border-crossing energy that reveals truth through comedic misadventure, through cleverness and misdirection, and through the consequences those deeds generate. The trickster's laughter is not merely a joke, it is a corrective to the ego's pretensions. It unsettles, invites humility, and often becomes a conduit through which culture comes to see its own contradictions. The wise old man is the phase or figure of wisdom and guidance that appears in dreams and myths as a mentor who dispenses insight, not as a tyrant but as a patient teacher. Merlin, Gandalf, Socrates in mythic attire, these are variations on a timeless pattern, a figure who embodies discernment, tolerance, and a certain quiet authority. The wise old man's presence in a story invites the younger protagonist to slow down, listen, and consider a larger horizon. He is the voice that invites the hero to endure a test that goes beyond strength or cunning. It is an invitation to wisdom, to a vision that respects mystery as well as knowledge. A crucial claim in Jung's project is that these archetypes do not originate in single lives, but in a collective psyche. They do not come into being because a particular person thought of them once. They arise again and again because they are rooted in something shared by humanity as a species. The channels of transmission are dreams, myths, rites, art, literature, and religious practice, all of which are capable of saturating a culture with the same symbolic motifs even when the languages and historical contexts differ. The language of the collective unconscious is the language of images, symbols, and motifs that carry a certain power to organize experience. It is not a language of words alone, but a language of resonance, a set of resonant pictures that pull the mind toward particular questions, tensions, and possibilities. To see these patterns in action, let us dwell on three vivid examples that Jung would likely have placed at the center of any systematic account. The hero as a universal narrative arc, the mother archetype in myth and literature, and the trickster across diverse traditions. First, the hero. The hero's journey is a narrative arc that shows up in a staggering variety of cultures. From the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to the Greek labors of Heracles, to the Indian epic of the Ramayana and the life story of Krishna, to the modern filmic journeys such as Star Wars, the core structure is recognizable. A call to adventure, a departure from the known world, trials and temptations, transformations, a return with something of value that reshapes the world. The arc embodies the interplay of four archetypes. The self as the goal and the measure of growth, the shadow that tests the hero's inner limits, the anima or animus that mediates the hero's relationship to inner and outer partners, and the persona that shapes the hero's presentation to others. The hero's journey is not a single invention. It is a pattern that travels across time, gathering new particles of meaning with each retelling, each adaptation, each new culture's own mythic layering. Consider, as a vivid illustration, the way the hero's journey unfolds in a modern myth, in a film like Star Wars, for instance. Luke Skywalker is introduced with a simple, almost ordinary life. The call to adventure arises when Princess Leia's message arrives via Art-Wo-Dit-Wo, and the journey begins with leaving the ordinary world behind. He is led into trials that test his courage, his loyalty, his capacity for restraint in the face of power, and his willingness to face the shadow within himself, the fear of joining with the dark side or the temptation to violence without wisdom. The anima or animus appears in Luke's inner dialogue about his own future, about who he could become when the burden of responsibility lands on his shoulders. The persona is visible in the way he plays an outward role as a hero, at first unprepared for the role but gradually taking it on, refining his self-understanding as the journey continues. And the self manifests as the inner center that requires him to accept the responsibility of a larger, more integrated identity, one that includes his lineage, his mentors, and the broader moral horizon of the galaxy. Second, the mother archetype in myth and literature shows how deeply maternal images embed themselves in human imagination, often carrying both warmth and threat, life and limit. Demeter in the Greek myth, who searches for her daughter Persephone and whose longing for reunion shapes the cycle of the seasons. Gaia, the Earth Mother whose presence underwrites the structure of life itself. The Virgin Mary in Christian iconography, who embodies a paradox, divine protection and intercession, maternal compassion and restraint before the divine plan. In literature, the mother archetype appears not only as a physical mother, but as the symbol of nurture and foundation. It can be a figure of safety and growth, a grandmother who tells stories that stitch a family together. It can also be a symbol of the land itself, the earth that sustains life but also demands stewardship. The mother figure can cradle the child, offering a space for development, but she can also be the matrix of dependency, the source of fear and overprotection, the force that sometimes consumes the individuality of those she bears. When we meet the mother archetype in fiction or in myth, we meet a pressure toward balance, tenderness without suffocation, care without coercion, a way to become strong without severing ties to the wellspring of life that the mother represents. Third, the trickster across traditions. The trickster is not merely a jest or a nuisance. He is a mover of the social and moral terrain, often insisting that norms, borders, and hierarchies be tested, questioned, reimagined. Anansi the spider, the cunning storyteller who uses wit to survive and outsmart more powerful figures, embodies a social function, to reveal how cunning, humor, and improvisation can enact justice in fragile systems. Loki, the trickster of Norse myth, unsettles the cosmos not only for entertainment, but to expose the fragility of order and the complexities of power and responsibility. Coyote, the trickster among many indigenous peoples of North America, plays with boundaries, between land and water, between life and death, between order and chaos, until something shifts. A new possibility arises, sometimes a difficult one, sometimes a healing one. In each case, the trickster unsettles the comfortable assumption that the world is a simple stage with obvious roles. The trickster's presence is a reminder that reality is textured, contradictory, and alive, that growth often comes through encounters with what is unexpected, unruly, or embarrassing. The trickster does not solve everything. Rather, he unsettles, and in unsettling, creates space for transformation. These three archetypes, the hero, the mother, and the trickster, do not stand alone. They interweave with the other core figures and with countless images across cultures. The self draws the hero toward the fountain of wholeness, the shadow lurks behind the hero's triumph, the anima or animus mediates inner dialogue about partnership and balance, and the persona frames how the world will receive a given achievement. The mother undergirds whether a journey ends in renewal or in dependence, whether growth is a genuine expansion or a return to the womb of safety, and whether the individual can risk the challenge of breaking free from that protective shell to become a person capable of authentic choice. The trickster tests the integrity of both the self and the culture, forcing difficult conversations about justice, mercy, cunning, and humility. And the wise old man appears as the patient witness who can help the adventurer translate the experience into wisdom rather than sheer novelty. When Jung explains the transmission of these patterns, he is addressing a remarkable question. If the spirit of humanity's experiences repeats motifs across the globe, if the same shapes emerge time and again, what is being transmitted and how? He posits that these patterns are not products of a single mind or a diverse set of minds in isolation, but products of a collective psyche that has been formed by the long arc of human evolution. The shapes of life, birth, death, nourishment, risk, love, fear, have a communal texture that permeates dreams and myths regardless of language or local custom. The forms are not random, they are structured. They are not invented anew with every dawn. They are discovered again with each generation, as if the human mind has a library of templates stored deep within it, awaiting a dream, a myth, a ritual, or a work of art to illumine their presence. Jung's account is thus not a defensible theory of a separate, static realm of universal symbols painted once and for all. It is a dynamic theory. Archetypes exist as tendencies toward form, and the collective unconscious is the medium that makes it possible for these forms to appear across disparate civilizations. They arise out of a historical and biological context that binds humans through time, through shared experiences of infancy, death, fear, ecstasy, and longing. Dreams become bilingual prints of the same pages that myths use to tell their stories, and art becomes the cultural elaboration of those stories. The collective unconscious, then, is like a vast, ancient library of motifs that every individual brain can access when images arise that cannot be easily traced to one's personal memory or daily life. To deepen the sense of what this means in practice, consider two more dimensions of Jung's thought that have been crucial for his followers and for critics alike: the role of symbols and the function of inner dialogue, what he called active imagination, and the relationship of these ideas to the living, changing world around us. Symbols for Jung are not mere signs, they are living carriers, vessels that can hold layers of meaning. A symbol can be a mandala, a child's fantasy, a mythic creature, a genealogical tree within a dream, or a religious emblem. What makes a symbol powerful is not its superficial similarity to something else, but its capacity to invoke a sense of connection to the whole. The symbol speaks in a language that can cross personal memory and cultural conditioning and point toward something greater than the sum of its parts. This is why artists, mystics, and scientists sometimes report a similar sense of awe when encountering a symbol that appears to be larger than their own project. The symbol carries a charge that invites contemplation, and contemplation, slow, patient, and open, allows for the symbol to reveal its layered meanings over time. Active imagination is Jung's method for engaging with the contents of the unconscious in a conscious, deliberate way. It is a disciplined daydream, a dialogue with figures that appear in a dream or a myth, a way of asking questions of the inner world and listening to the responses as a way to form a more coherent self. It is not an exercise in fantasy as escape. It is a method for translating the life of the psyche into images and words that can be examined, discussed, and integrated into waking life. The aim is not to produce a particular conclusion, but to cultivate awareness, to bring one's inner life into contact with daily life, to contain the power of inner images instead of letting them erupt as unexamined forces. Jung's interview with two very different worlds, the world of myth and dream on one hand, the world of modern science and cross-cultural philosophy on the other, reflects in his curiosity about the I Ching and alchemical symbolism as living expressions of the collective psyche. The I Ching, or Book of Changes, is a text of ancient wisdom that uses hexagrams to describe transformations in life and the relationships among opposing forces, yin and yang in a constant dance of change. Jung's engagement with the I Ching was not a mere curiosity about an Oriental philosophy. It was a serious attempt to test whether a symbolic system could act as a living mirror of the unconscious. He believed that this system could serve as a tangible way to access a shared psychic substratum that moves across cultures, a kind of cross-cultural resonance that reflects archetypal patterns in a way that a purely Western framework could struggle to capture. In his collaboration with the Swiss physician and sinologist, and through his own experiments with dream interpretation and active imagination, Jung sought to demonstrate that these patterns, archetypes, symbols, and the process of transformation are not bound to one culture or one era, but are part of the human psyche's long conversation with itself. Equally important in Jung's own life were two crucial historical moments that shaped his view of archetypes as living forces with real historical and experiential import. The first is his early fascination with myth and fairy tale analysis, the moment when Jung's attention moved away from a purely medical or psychiatric perspective toward the more inclusive horizon of myth, symbol, and the inner life. Long before the term collective unconscious had fully crystallized, Jung was reading fairy tales and myths the way a scientist reads specimens, looking for patterns that recur across cultures, asking what such patterns reveal about the human soul's needs, fears, and aspirations. He wrote about the images that populate dreams and myths as universal mental forms rather than as local content, and that shift toward a language of archetypes marked a turning point in his thinking. This is the historical anecdote of Jung turning from a clinical inclinations toward an interpretive, symbolic approach to human experience. He did not abandon the clinical. Rather, he expanded the field of inquiry to include a broader symbolic dimension that could unify clinical work with the vast, cross-cultural, historical life of humanity. The second historical anecdote concerns his engagement with the I Ching and alchemical symbolism as living expressions of the collective psyche. When Jung encountered the I Ching, he did not simply treat it as a historical artifact. He treated it as a living instrument that could reveal something about how the unconscious speaks through symbols that are not tied to any single culture's language or narrative. He found the hexagrams and the process of consulting them eloquent testimonies to the idea that the psyche, when allowed to speak, generates images and signs that can be read across time and space. The alchemical symbolism for Jung offered a dramatic stage on which the drama of psychological transformation could be enacted. The images that arise in alchemy, the opus of transformation, the burning away of impurities, the union of opposites, the creation of a new unity, mirror the inner work of the individuation process. Alchemy's symbols are not simply quaint remnants of medieval science. They encode archetypal patterns that the unconscious can recognize and which the conscious mind can learn to translate into lived experience. In Jung's thinking, these living expressions, myth, fairy tale, I Ching, alchemical imagery, are not artifacts to be studied in isolation. They are expressions of the same deep structures of the psyche, the same patterns that can appear in dreams as well as in temple, painting, literature, and law. With that historical anchor in mind, we can consider the two major lines of critique that have accompanied Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious. The first is the critique that archetypes lack robust empirical corroboration. Critics have asked for clear, replicable demonstrations that these patterns exist in the sense of verifiable, falsifiable constructs. After all, the scientific enterprise often seeks measurable data, controlled experiments, and testable hypotheses. Archetypes, by their very nature, are symbolic and interpretive. They arise in dream reports, narratives, and myths where personal and cultural meanings are braided in ways that resist straightforward measurement. The charge is that what counts as evidence for archetypes can slip into circular reasoning. If a dream features a dragon in one culture and a dragon-like creature in another, is that an archetype, or is it a projection of common human concerns about danger, heat, and power? Proponents reply that the value of archetypes lies not in presenting a conventional chemical proof, but in offering a robust interpretive framework that can account for cross-cultural motifs, for patterns of dream content, and for the transformative potential of myth. They argue that archetypes function as organizing schemes, not as physical entities. They are phenomenological claims about the psyche's habitual ways of organizing experience. The second critique concerns cultural bias and the risk of overinterpreting ambiguous symbols. If one begins with the assumption that certain motifs are archetypal and then reads every dream or myth through that lens, there is a danger that the analyst will discover what they already expected to find. This is a familiar trap in the humanities and social sciences, the tendency to see confirmation of one's theoretical commitments in the material one studies. Critics warn that Jung's framework can inadvertently project a Western, individualistic, even spiritualized psychology onto cultures that have different values, worldviews, and symbol families. They remind us that mythic patterns can be real enough in their effects within a given culture, but that to call them universal is to risk erasing difference, to mistake similarity for sameness, to obscure historical relations of power, conquest, and exchange that shape myth-making and ritual. How have contemporary depth psychologists and anthropologists engaged with these ideas? Some have embraced the richness of Jungian psychology for its emphasis on growth, transformation, and meaning. John Beebe, for example, has expanded the language of archetypes by describing a functional map of the psyche that includes the self, the shadow, the anima/animus, and other figures in a way that makes them operational in clinical work and personal development. His approach, while rooted in Jungian theory, integrates modern psychodynamic insights about personality structure and cognitive bias. Other depth psychologists have taken a more critical turn. James Hillman, a central figure in archetypal psychology, challenges the idea that archetypes are universal or strictly mental constructs. For Hillman, archetypes are real in their effects and become the soul of an image or a moment. He emphasizes the necessity of listening to images in their own right, not merely interpreting them according to a fixed schema. This stance shifts the conversation from discovering universal motifs to honoring the particularities of how images speak in a given life or culture, while still maintaining that those images arise from a deeper psychic life. Anthropology, too, offers important contributions. Structuralist thinkers such as Claude Lévi-Strauss asked whether myths reveal universal cognitive structures, but they argued that myths are more about the organization of experience and the generation of meaning than about pre-existing, fixed images. They would say that myths encode social rules and cultural logic, and that the patterns we see as archetypal may be the product of shared human concerns made legible through specific linguistic and symbolic forms. To this, Jungians respond that even if myths are structured by social and linguistic constraints, the fact that similar motifs appear across widely separated cultures suggests the presence of something that transcends their immediate contexts, an experiential core that cannot be reduced to local conventions alone. The debate, then, is not whether patterns exist, but how we interpret their scope, how we test their explanatory power, and how we respect the integrity of other cultures while engaging with universal questions about human life. In modern interpretive practice, Jung's ideas are often employed not to declare absolute universals, but to illuminate the psychological processes that underlie personal growth, creativity, and resilience. Therapy, education, and creative arts therapy frequently use the language of archetypes to help people recognize recurring patterns in their dreams and life narratives, to understand the roles they adopt in relationships, and to imagine more conscious choices in the face of fear or confusion. The concept of individuation, a lifelong movement toward wholeness, a process that invites the conscious and unconscious selves to collaborate rather than compete, remains a powerful frame for personal development. In the arts, the archetypal lens helps readers and viewers recognize symbolic patterns, the hero's journey, the trickster's disruptive energy, the mother's presence, that resonate across cultures and epochs, offering a shared space in which experiences of longing, risk, and transformation can be discussed with openness rather than fear. If we were to translate Jung's philosophy into practical, everyday life, what would it look like? It would look like a patient curiosity about one's dreams as well as one's waking life. It would look like a willingness to map one's inner world with humility, noting when a pattern repeats in a dream, and when a symbol returns in a work of art or in a relationship's repeating dynamic. It would involve a practice of dialogue with the inner figures, a form of inner conversation that is not purely cognitive but imaginal, not merely intellectual but sensory and affective too. It would entail recognizing that the psyche's depth is not a private reserve, but part of a shared human heritage, a living inheritance that invites us to translate its language into actions that honor both individuality and a larger sense of life's interwoven pattern. Let us now draw a few cross-references to other influential voices that deepen or challenge Jung's framework. Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces popularized the idea of a universal monomyth, the idea that the hero's journey is a cross-cultural, cross-historical structure that underlies many myths and modern stories. Campbell argued that mythic motifs recur because they express the human experience of transformation, initiation, and personal integration into a larger order. The effect of Campbell's work is to situate Jung's archetypes within a broader narrative theory about human meaning and storytelling. Yet Campbell's monomyth is not without critique. Critics point out that not all world mythologies fit neatly into a single 12-stage sequence, and some argue that Campbell's synthesis glosses over historical and cultural specifics that would complicate the universality claim. The dialogue between Jungian archetypes and Campbell's monomyth, then, is a fertile ground for exploration. One provides a robust, symbolically rich vocabulary for inner life. The other offers a grand narrative of universal storytelling. Together, they invite a more expansive conversation about how humans make sense of experience through images, symbols, and stories. Iliad's work on myth and mythic time also offers a parallel and a counterpoint. Iliad emphasized myth as a hierophany, a manifestation of the sacred in the world that makes cosmic order visible in human life. In his account, myth is not mere private psychology. It carries the power to open us to the sacred, to frame time as a revelation rather than a sequence of events. Jung's framework intersects with Iliad's in the sense that both acknowledge the power of myth to structure meaning, but they begin in different places. Jung starts from the psyche's depth and looks for universals in symbols that appear in dreams and art. Iliad starts from the religious phenomenon in which the sacred penetrates time and space. Their overlap lies in recognizing that myth has a power beyond mere social function. It has a capacity to reorganize the way people relate to themselves, to others, and to the world they inhabit. The difference, perhaps, is that Jung emphasizes the interior psychological processes that produce myth, whereas Alid emphasizes the external, cultural, and sacred significance of myth in human life. Freud offered a rival and later critique of universal motifs. Freud's broader theory of the human psyche, its drives, experiences of infancy, and the way these shape culture, was often read as a counterweight to the Jungian emphasis on archetypes. Freud's interpretive lens tended to emphasize sexual and aggressive drives as the primary engines behind many myths. His famous belief in wish fulfillment as a mechanism for mythic representation suggested that the universality of motifs might be a product of common psychosexual dynamics in the human species. In Jung's account, archetypes are more than just disguised wishes. They express patterns of transformation that guide the psyche toward wholeness through symbolic work. In subsequent debates, Jung and Freud clashed, and their disagreements laid the groundwork for a larger conversation about whether human culture expresses a set of universal symbolic forms, or whether symbol formation is primarily a product of individual psychology and the particular social historical context. Later, Freud's critics would point out that his framework can be dehumanizing or reductive if applied to the richness of myth in diverse cultures, but his insistence on the inner life of the mind, especially the role of early experiences in shaping later life, still remains a vital counterpoint to Jung's broad, arguably more optimistic, universalism. That said, contemporary depth psychologists and anthropologists do not reject Jung outright. They have embraced the sense that images and motifs have an enduring power to shape the human experience. They have also insisted on disciplining the method, to respect the interpretive nature of archetypes and to test claims in ways that acknowledge cultural differences and the importance of context. In clinical practice, the Jungian approach to therapy emphasizes engagement with the dream material, creative expression, active imagination, and a patient journey toward individuation, an ongoing, evolving process rather than a destination. In anthropology, the search for cross-cultural motifs remains a vital line of inquiry, but it is accompanied by a careful attention to how symbols acquire meaning within specific communities and histories. Rather than reading a litany of archetypes into every myth, contemporary scholars preserve a sense of openness. The possibility that the psyche's patterns are real and meaningful, but that their expression must be understood in relation to local meanings, social structures, and history. We can also consider modern interpretations outside the strictly clinical or academic frame. In literature and cinema, for example, the archetypes appear again and again as structuring devices that help readers and viewers recognize the shape of a story and locate themselves within it. The hero's journey remains a powerful heuristic for writers and filmmakers who wish to craft narratives about growth, courage, and transformation. The trickster continues to appear in novels and screenplays as the figure who upends expectations, nudges the audience toward humility, and invites a more nuanced view of power, responsibility, and cunning. The mother archetype appears in diverse forms, from stories of nurturing guardianship to narratives of mother-daughter tension and the complicated love that binds a family. In these contexts, Jung's language of archetypes functions as an interpretive tool that helps audiences notice the dreamlike texture of everyday life, the way stories, images, and symbols organize experience even when we are not fully conscious of their influence. What about real-world applications beyond therapy and art? In education, teachers can help students understand how archetypal patterns shape both personal development and cultural literacy. By exploring myths and stories from different cultures, students may learn to recognize how certain archetypes, like the hero or the mother, reappear in varied costumes and contexts, and thereby gain a sense of human continuity across differences. In organizational life, leaders and teams can use archetypal language to understand team dynamics, leadership challenges, and the development of a shared vision. In spiritual practice, archetypal psychology invites a respectful engagement with symbols, rituals, and images that carry meaning across generations. It invites participants to listen to the inner voice behind the symbols and to honor the sense that life is a story in which the self and the world are continually being reimagined. Finally, we can look to a future in which Jung's ideas live not as an immutable doctrine, but as a living vocabulary for an ever more diverse set of perspectives. Modern depth psychology continues to refine and sometimes challenge the universality of archetypes by integrating a broader range of voices, including those of people whose experiences have historically been marginalized or silenced. Anthropologists push for a nuanced understanding of how symbols acquire meaning in different social formations, including societies that may not share the same mythic inherited patterns as those of Western Europe. Yet the impulse behind Jung's project remains potent, the belief that beneath the surface of personal life and cultural products there are deep, resonant patterns that help us make sense of our fears, our longings, and our attempts to become more fully human. If we listen with care to the images that arise in our dreams and our myths, we may find not a fixed set of universal symbols, but a living conversation that invites us to grow toward a more integrated, more compassionate, and more imaginative life. As we conclude this segment, let us hold in mind several guiding threads. The first is that archetypes are not rigid categories or empty abstractions. They are dynamic, living forms that organize psychic energy in the face of experience. The second is that the collective unconscious is not a museum of repressed content only. It is a dynamic field in which the deepest layers of the human condition reveal themselves through dreams, myths, art, and ritual, urging us toward a process Jung called individuation, a becoming more fully oneself in conversation with the wider dimensions of life. The third is that these patterns cross cultures, time, and language, appearing again in stories, symbols, and practices around the world, inviting us to recognize a shared human heritage even as we honor the diversity that makes each culture unique. The fourth is that, despite the legitimate critiques regarding empirical corroboration and cultural bias, the Jungian framework offers a powerful lens for exploring questions that matter. Who am I when I am most true to my inner life? What is the meaning of my dreams if they are not simply private theatrical performances, but echoes of a deeper, collective history? How do we cultivate a life of growth, resilience, and responsibility in the face of fear, temptation, and ambiguity? A closing reflection invites us to consider how this philosophy of archetypes and collective patterns speaks to everyday life. When we notice the recurring images that appear in our dreams, the self glimmering at the edge of consciousness, the shadow stepping forward with a surprising courage, the anima or animus guiding us toward a more balanced relationship with our own gendered energies, the persona we wear, the mother who nurtures, the trickster who unsettles, and the wise old man who offers patient counsel, we are learning to recognize the inner atmosphere that shapes perception and action. It is not a map to rigid destinations, it is a map to a process. It invites us to become more conscious of how inner life interacts with outer life, to attend to the dream's call to transformation, and to approach myths with a sense of responsibility for our own growth and for the well-being of the communities we belong to. The work of Jung, Campbell, Eliade, Freud, and contemporary thinkers remains a conversation across generations about what myths and symbols are for humanity. Whether they are traces of an ancestral cognitive structure, whether they are the echoes of a sacred reality that humbles us, or whether they are tools we use to navigate our own emotional and ethical development. The true value lies not in proving one school right over another, but in recognizing how these ideas illuminate our deepest questions about meaning, belonging, and the shape of our own becoming. If we proceed with caution, curiosity, and humility, the archetypes can become an invitation to a life lived with more attention, more candor, and more imagination, toward a future in which the individual grows within a culture that can nourish not only reason but also the dream, the symbol, and the myth that dwell within the collective soul. Individuation, dream work, and therapeutic practice. If we listen closely to Jung himself, this is not a single technique or a one-off intervention. It is a lifelong conversation with the psyche, a turning toward the deepest layers of who we are, a patient and sometimes paradoxical journey toward wholeness. The world speaks in dreams, in images, in the strange sentences that arise when consciousness rests long enough to hear the other voice within. Individuation is the process, and the self, which Jung described as the center and circumference of the psyche, is both the horizon and the compass by which we navigate that journey. To begin with, let us sketch the terrain, what individuation is, why it matters, and how the tension between conscious content and the vast, often unruly unconscious can become a source of growth rather than a trap. Then we will walk through the practical heart of Jungian therapy, the dream work, the role of active imagination, and concrete examples in which these ideas become living, actionable experiences. We will also pause to address the criticisms that arise when a theory leans so heavily on mythic structures, and we will connect Jung's insights to Freudian dream interpretation, Erik Erikson's account of identity, and contemporary therapies that foreground narrative and symbol. The center of Jung's vision is not a neat system, but a dynamic drama in which opposites meet, clash, and fuse. The conscious and the unconscious are not two separate rooms in a house. They are two faces of the same psyche, two ways in which life presents itself to a person who is trying to become more themselves. The first image we must hold in mind is that the self is not a static endpoint, but a living totality that gravity pulls toward integration. Jung's famous line, often rendered in various translations, remains a useful compass. The self is the circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. In other words, it is both the center of the psyche and the endless field within which all contents of the psyche participate. It is the idea that wholeness is not found by erasing differences, but by bringing them into a usable, creative relationship. When we talk about individuation, we talk about aligning the human being with the deep rhythm of their own life, the rhythm that is older than any one role we play in the world, a rhythm that will not be silenced or dismissed by social expectations, even though those expectations are loud and persistent. Individuation unfolds in stages, although Jung did not inventory them as a step-by-step manual the way a modern self-help workbook might. Instead, he described a trajectory, an inner pilgrimage through the realms of the psyche. The most immediate and continual tension is between the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask we present to the world, the face we show to colleagues, family, clients, and strangers. It is not inherently bad. It is a necessary tool, a compromise with reality. The shadow, by contrast, is the part of ourselves we deny, repress, or disown, the blind spots, the impulses, the feelings that do not fit the social script. The first real test of individuation is not to cast the shadow out, but to learn how to recognize it, to understand what it wants, and to integrate its energy in a form that can be consciously governed rather than unconsciously ruling us. Let me pause here to highlight a core move in Jung's theory. The shadow is not simply evil, it is energy that has not found a socially sanctioned home. If we label it entirely as bad, we risk losing the very vitality that the unconscious can offer. If we ignore it, it grows louder in dreams and life events until it cannot be ignored without some price. The process of bringing the shadow into consciousness involves both acknowledgement and transformation. It often begins as a confrontation, a dream figure, a situation in which we react with disproportionate intensity, a recurring impulse that seems to pull us in directions we do not consciously desire. The confrontation with the shadow opens a larger door into the realm of the anima or the animus, into the personal universe of complexes, and eventually into the self itself. The second major hinge in this journey is the encounter with the inner feminine or masculine figure, the anima in a man, the animus in a woman. The anima/animus is not merely sexual energy. It is a representation of the psyche's other half, the image that carries the complementary aspects of mind and heart, of rationality and feeling, of memory and imagination. For a man, the anima can appear as a female figure who speaks in poetry, who embodies tenderness, intuition, and relational wisdom. For a woman, the animus can appear as a male figure who embodies logical argument, strategic planning, and the capacity to take decisive action. The encounter with the anima/animus is not simply about romance. It is about recognizing the other half of the psyche as an ally rather than a threat. It is how the psyche learns to speak in a more capacious language, so that reason can be warmed by intuition and feeling can gain shape in thought. A third compass point is the relationship with symbols and archetypes, the language of dreaming and imagination that speaks in images rather than propositions. Jung insisted that the unconscious speaks in symbols that are not arbitrary but meaningful within a given life. The archetypes, patterns that appear across cultures and eras, such as the hero, the great mother, the trickster, do not dictate a single fate for every person, but they provide a shared repertoire that can help the psyche recognize its own content when it appears in dreams, visions, or creative work. The self uses symbols to communicate what cannot be said in plain language, to invite a new integration that cannot be reached by reason alone. This is where the transcendent function comes into play, the psychic energy that reconciles opposites by creating a new form that emerges from the tension between conscious intention and unconscious influence. The transcendent function is not a magic fix. It is a patient, often paradoxical synthesis that grows through listening, playing with images, and allowing meaning to emerge. If we want to understand the practical core of Jungian therapy, we must turn to two interwoven activities, dream work and active imagination. Dream work, in Jung's account, is not a simple interpretive exercise of decoding latent wishes as Freud might have proposed. It is a diagnostic and transformative practice in which the dream content is taken as a message from the psyche, one that often has compensatory functions, balancing what the waking life misrepresents about us, correcting an excess in one direction, illuminating blind spots, and offering a symbolic script of what must be integrated. The steps are straightforward in spirit, though they are never mechanical in execution. First, recall and describe the dream in as much detail as possible. Then note all associations, the details, colors, feelings, places that arise spontaneously. Then amplify the dream, using myth, literature, or personal life events to enrich the symbolic net. Then look for motifs that signal a split between conscious content and unconscious energy. A dream may present a scene of a person in a suit negotiating a storm at sea, The storm is the unconscious life. The suit is the persona. The person who speaks indirectly through weather is the shadow. The interpretation is not about labeling a single truth, but about listening for a change in the dream's energy, a sign that a new relation between the conscious stance and unconscious content has become possible. Active imagination operates in a different register, a bridge between waking awareness and the living material of the unconscious. It is not a trance. It is a disciplined, creative dialogue with inner figures, images, and scenes that spontaneously arise when the mind is still enough to hear them. In practice, it begins with a quiet moment of attention, an image, a voice, a landscape, or a figure who seems to step forward from the interior darkness. One then treats that inner scene as if one were conversing with a person. Ask questions, listen, and respond, letting the imagery unfold in a form that can be written, painted, sculpted, or performed. The therapeutic power of active imagination lies in its capacity to translate the soul's speech into a narrative that can be reflected upon, tested against waking life, and ultimately fused into a more complex but coherent sense of self. It is a practice of receptivity as much as a practice of control, a gentle negotiation with the psyche's own agency. To ground these ideas in concrete practice, consider 3 examples that Jung might recognize as emblematic of the path toward integration. The first example comes from dream analysis that reveals a conflict between persona and shadow. Imagine a professional who has spent years building a polished, achievement-oriented persona, the reliable, confident clinician, the socially adept colleague, the person who can always present a calm, rational front. One night they dream of a large, stormy ocean and a shoreline crowded with discarded masks. On the beach, the dreamer sees their own face in one mask after another, each mask changing in tone and emotion, from a stern, know-it-all mask to a scared, deflated mask. The ocean's waves crash, the masks keep slipping away, revealing features that feel unfamiliar, even frightening. In the dream, the masks begin to talk back. One mask confesses that it has learned to suppress anger, while another admits that it hides deep grief about a relationship that failed to honor vulnerability. The analysis reveals a conflict between persona, the mask of competence, and shadow, the unacknowledged anger and grief that haunt that mask, pushing it to overcompensate. The healing move is not to discard the persona, but to let the persona be educated by the shadow's truth, to create a new stance in which competence is not merely a social performance, but a vulnerable, honest form of leadership. The dream points to a path of integration. The clinician must learn to hold space for anger and grief, to communicate with clients not only as a calm, objective observer, but as a person capable of genuine, embodied feeling. The dream thus becomes a guide for how to talk differently in the waking life, how to acknowledge parts of the self that the persona has banished, and how to stand with the patient in a more authentic, more humane posture. The second example concerns an image from active imagination that bridges rational thought and symbol. Picture someone who has trained themselves to live in a rational, analytic world yet feels a persistent pull toward something ineffable, an image, a sense of knowing that cannot be captured in a chart or a textbook. During a session of active imagination, the person envisions a room filled with glass walls, a kind of library where every shelf is transparent. In the center stands a gatekeeper who speaks in precise, measured language about rules and categories. Then another voice, the symbol of a river, emerges from a corner of the room and begins to flood the floor with flowing, expressive imagery, colors, forms, shapes that seem to defy the rules of the room. The gatekeeper resists. The river pushes through. A dialogue unfolds in which the rational, gatekeeping voice acknowledges the river's power and asks how to translate its fluid language into something that can guide decision-making, while the river asks how the rational voice can accept uncertainty without losing clarity. The image becomes a symbolic synthesis. Rational judgment and symbolic knowing begin to co-create a new stance, one that can govern decisions with both procedural accuracy and imaginative insight. In waking life, this person might apply a disciplined decision-making process to a complex problem, but they now allow a symbolic, emotionally informed dimension to inform the outcome, perhaps by using a metaphor, a visual diagram, or a narrative that communicates the deeper significance of each option. The point is not to abandon rational thought, but to let the symbol carry a layer of meaning that helps prevent a purely linear, possibly brittle result. The third example concerns a creative project or life decision that symbolically illustrates the integration of masculine and feminine aspects. Here we might imagine someone who has long identified with the masculine qualities of direction, assertiveness, and goal-driven energy, qualities esteemed in many professional contexts. Yet life presents a crossroads. A creative project that would require collaboration, receptivity, and relational nuance. the feminine energies that tend to be undervalued in certain fields. The symbolic act is a decision to embark on a co-authored, interdisciplinary project that treats collaboration as a form of leadership rather than a concession to others' ideas. The process of starting such a project becomes, in practical terms, a ritual of integration. The decision to invite a partner with complementary strengths, the willingness to share credit, the creation of a governance structure that honors both initiative and listening, and the use of imagery in the project's identity. Logos that incorporate both sharp lines and flowing forms, narratives that tell the story of conflict, compromise, and synthesis rather than the triumph of one will over another. This life decision, symbolically framed, becomes a lived example of the integration of masculine and feminine energies, a microcosm of the wider individuation process. Now let us tell two historical anecdotes that illuminate Jung's method from inside his own life. The first is Jung's use of active imagination in his own life, a practice that would become central to his theory. In his own late adolescence and early adulthood, Jung found himself drawn to the interior life with a seriousness that might be described as a discipline of listening. As he entered the tumultuous years around the First World War and the break with Freud, he faced a crisis of meaning and authority. He began to cultivate dialogues with inner figures, a practice that would later be transcribed in a form that is both intimate and monumental, the Red Book, Liber Novus. In those pages and sketches, Jung wrote as if into a living mirror, giving voice to figures who appeared to him in dreams or daydreams, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes wholly other. Philemon, a sage guide, emerges as a recurring interlocutor in these pages, a figure who articulates a different way of thinking about the psyche, one that values the symbolic life and recognizes the autonomy of the unconscious. The Red Book thus becomes not a private diary of fantasies, but a record of the psyche's own movement toward wholeness. It is a narrative of initiation, a journey through the underworld of images and meanings, in which Jung learns to take what arises from the unconscious seriously, to treat it as a legitimate teacher rather than a dangerous impulse to be suppressed. The Red Book is both a record of inner life and a statement about the legitimacy of inner life as something that must be acknowledged and engaged if a person is to become more fully themselves. Second anecdote. Jung's later clinical orientation that blended dream interpretation with symbolic life events. After this watershed period, the turn toward the symbol, the encounter with the self, the clinical practice Jung developed was not simply about diagnosing a pathology and prescribing a fixed technique. He moved toward a form of psychotherapy that treated dreams not as mere wish fulfillment, but as doorways to the psyche's deeper organization. He would attend to the dream's symbolic content, its compensatory function, and its potential to answer to an ongoing life event. The therapy would not end with interpretation in the Freudian sense. Instead, the material from dreams and from active imagination would be related to the patient's life situation, work, relationships, and commitments. The patient's life events themselves could become subject matter for the imagination. Images and symbols would arise spontaneously in the therapy room, and these symbols would be used to illuminate patterns in the patient's life that required restructuring or reauthentication. The clinical method thus came to emphasize the narrative of the life, how the patient tells their story matters as much as the content of the dream or image. It is not a simple technique, but a stance, one that trusts that the psyche has its own sense of time and development, a tempo that cannot be forced, only listened to in the patient's own words and images. That is perhaps a good moment to address some counterarguments, for if Jung's vision is seductive in its poetic power, it must also withstand scrutiny. The first counterargument concerns generalizability across cultures. Jung's language about archetypes and the collective unconscious implies that there are universal patterns of psychic life that appear in dreams and myths across human societies. Critics worry that this risks assuming a kind of cultural universality that may not actually exist. If the mother archetype is present in a particular form in one culture, but is differently cultivated or coded in another, or if another culture's myths accumulate around different figures, then the claim of universal archetypes might overstate a common psychic grammar. One might argue that while some symbols resonate across cultures, others are historically and culturally contingent, shaped by social conditions, language, religion, and power structures. This does not render Jung's insights useless, but it does ask us to temper claims of universality with careful ethnographic and cross-cultural work. It invites us to ask, how does the individuation process adapt when a person's symbolic repertoire is deeply colored by a tradition that has very different roots from the Western myths Jung often drew upon? The answer might be that the form of the symbol is culturally flavored, but the psychic need for integration, the drive to become more than the superficial mask, may be a common human possibility, even if the images that fulfill it vary. A second counterargument concerns the emphasis on myth and symbol potentially overshadowing socioeconomic factors. Critics may suggest that Jung's focus on inner life can become a retreat from social critique. If the psyche's inner myths are given primacy, might we lose sight of how structural conditions, poverty, racism, class oppression, labor exploitation, shape a person's possibilities and sense of self? When the internal drama is treated as the most central arena, there is a risk that the material conditions that produce those psychic energies are overlooked. The critique does not require that we abolish symbolic life as a field of meaning. It suggests that any theory of psyche in therapy should be robust enough to account for power, history, and material constraints. A responsible Jungian approach would, therefore, consider how oppression itself might manifest in the unconscious as a shadow that has learned to survive within the structures of daily life, or how collective traumas shaped by those structures become archetypal forms in dreams and myths. The integration of social analysis with symbolic work can be a way to meet the critique. The self's task is not to escape history, but to redeem it by turning its energies into wiser action, more just relations, and more authentic, ethical living. In making these points, we should also acknowledge how Jung's work intersects with and diverges from Freud's dream interpretation. Freud saw dreams as wishes disguised by symbolic masks and worked to decode those wishes in order to reveal latent content. In Jung's hands, dreams can be more than disguised wishes. They can be messages from the entire psyche, including the collective layer of the psyche, the archetypes, and they can carry a moral and developmental charge, inviting the dreamer toward a transformative synthesis. The difference is not merely technical, it is philosophical. Freud's method often moves from a premise that the psyche is driven by repressed forces seeking satisfaction. Jung's method moves toward the possibility that a life can be reorganized around a more expansive sense of meaning, a self that invites a person to become more themselves by embracing a larger symbolic life. The two approaches can be reconciled in practice by recognizing that a dream may carry both personal wishes and archetypal images that demand a new form of life, a form that integrates inner and outer realities, a form that makes a life more coherent. Let us also place Jung within a broader historical and theoretical arc by bringing in Erik Erikson's account of identity development. Erikson emphasized identity as an ongoing process through 8 psychosocial stages, with adolescence presenting a crisis of identity versus role confusion. This is not far from Jung's idea that the individual must become the person they are, rather than merely the person the culture expects them to be. Yet Erikson's framework foregrounds social and historical context, how the individual negotiates norms, roles, and expectations in a community and a culture. Jung, by focusing on the unconscious and the symbolic, widens the lens to illuminate how inner life can either support or complicate that negotiation. The two perspectives can be read as complementary rather than contradictory. Erikson highlights the social maturation that a person experiences, while Jung clarifies the inner maturation that makes social adaptation possible without losing authenticity. In practice, a therapeutic approach that blends Jungian dream work with Eriksonian insight might explore how dreams reflect not only personal conflicts but social identity tensions. What it means to belong, to be recognized, to stand up for one's values, and to shape an autonomous life in a world of competing demands. Looking forward into contemporary psychotherapeutic terrain, we can see how Jung's insistence on symbolic language and narrative elements has persisted and evolved. Several modern approaches share with Jung the belief that meaning and image matter profoundly in healing. Narrative therapy, developed by Michael White and David Epstein, treats people as storytellers who can reauthor their life stories in ways that open up new possibilities for action. The central move is to externalize problems, to separate the person from the problem, and to reframe life events as a plot with agents, motives, and changes. In Jungian terms, this is akin to giving space to the self's symbolic life and recognizing that the narrative one lives is not arbitrary but deeply connected to inner images and archetypal forms. Art therapy and imagery-based therapies offer another practical locus for Jungian ideas. In these modalities, patients work with drawings, paintings, sculpture, or symbolic play to express unconscious content in a nonverbal medium. The artwork is not merely a mirror of inner life, it can also become a partner in interpretation, an image with which the patient can dialogue, test, and integrate. Finally, there is a growing field of integrative and transpersonal psychology that treats spiritual and existential dimensions of experience as legitimate, not simply as therapy-avoidant illusions. The use of symbols, myths, and rituals in therapy finds a natural ally in Jung's reverence for the psychological significance of myth and symbol. All of these approaches share with Jung the conviction that meaning is not optional. It is a central action in healing. Let me bring a few accessible anchors to these ideas, quotes that illuminate the path drawn from Jung's own writings and the rich record of his work. Consider the concise, pointed affirmation. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. This line, extracted from Jung's broader discussions of consciousness and inner growth, captures the doorway through which the individuation process begins. It invites us to let the interior life illuminate what the exterior life cannot. Then there is the image of the self as the center and circumference of the psyche, the mathematical metaphor that is, in Jung's terms, the image of totality. The self is the whole circle, a unity that nonetheless manifests in every direction, a unity that is discovered not by erasing difference, but by letting difference converge and harmonize. The quote about the unconscious guiding our life until it is made conscious, until it is welcomed into daylight, has become a kind of rule of thumb for Jungian therapy. It reminds us that to remain at odds with the inner world is to remain at odds with the energy of life itself. To bring the unconscious forward is to invite life to speak with honesty about its needs and its gifts. The self is not a stern taskmaster. It is a wise companion who asks us to become more of what we already are, an individual who is both unique and connected, both strong in character and open to mystery. The work of the therapist, then, is not to impose a single interpretation, but to facilitate a conversation with the psyche. The therapist's stance matters as much as the content of dreams or images. Jungian therapy asks the therapist to be a listening presence, a witness to the client's unfolding, someone who can hold tension, reflect back moments of insight, and encourage the patient to experiment with new forms of living. It is not a passive witnessing, it is an active, collaborative process. The patient brings dreams, images, and life events. The therapist helps amplify those messages, supports the emergence of the self-symbols, and helps translate the symbolic insights into choices, behaviors, and relationships in the waking world. In practice, the therapeutic room becomes a workshop of meaning where the client learns to listen to the dream's language, to honor the energy of the image, and to translate that energy into a life that is both authentic and connected. If we want to see the arc of Jung's project in a sentence, we could say this: the psyche has its own authority, its own wisdom, and its own time. Our task is to learn to hear it, to treat its images as teachers, and to trust that its path toward wholeness does not demand a rejection of the world, but a re-education of our relationship to it. The process of individuation, as Jung envisioned it, is not a solitary pilgrimage into a private inner realm. It is a transformative practice that changes how we engage the world, how we make decisions, how we relate to others, and how we inhabit our own lives with a more generous sense of possibility. The ego is not dissolved, it is retimed, resituated, and reprojected in a larger frame that gives it resilience and elasticity. The shadows become not enemies, but partners in a moral and spiritual education. The anima or animus becomes not a threat to male or female identity, but a source of relational intelligence, helping us live in a way that honors both reason and feeling, structure and spontaneity. As we close this section, I invite you to reflect on your own life's images, dreams, and stories. What masks do you wear, and what energies do you keep hidden behind them? What figures, an elder, a child, a woman, or man from your inner landscape, emerge when you permit a moment of quiet to listen? What is it that your psyche is asking you to integrate, to acknowledge, to give form to? The path of individuation is demanding and rewarding in equal measure. It asks for courage to look inside, for patience to cultivate the inner dialogue, for humility to recognize that wisdom often arrives not as a sudden epiphany, but as a gradual rearrangement of meaning. If you are working with dreams or with images, remember that the goal is not to pin the dream down with a single, definitive interpretation, but to let the dream's energy redraft the shape of your waking life. The goal is not control, but companionship with what is larger than yourself. The goal is to find a stance in which you can, with growing confidence, say yes to the complexities of life, yes to the energies that ask for expression, and yes to the ongoing, uncompleted work of becoming yourself. In the end, Jung's account of individuation, dream work, and therapeutic practice offers a generous invitation. It asks us to suspend the impulse to fix things quickly, to slow down to the tempo of the psyche, to listen for images rather than slogans, to trust that a life told in symbols can be a life well lived. It invites us to see the psyche not as a battleground where instincts are suppressed, but as a garden where opposites are planted, tended, and allowed to mature into a form of unity that is neither rigid nor blind to the world's demands. It invites clinicians and clients alike to cultivate a way of knowing that treats dreams as real, images as instructive, and the self as a partner in a lifelong journey toward wholeness. And it invites us to hear again the two traditions under which Jung stood, the insistence that the inner life has its own law and order, and the confidence that, if we learn to converse with that law and order with honesty, the life that follows is wiser, more creative, and more human. The path is not closed by the first storm, it is clarified by it. The journey toward the self, toward the circle and its center that lies within us all continues, a patient labor and a hopeful horizon that invites us to become more fully who we are, while staying open to who we might become, in relationship with others, with the world, and with the enduring mystery that lives at the heart of the psyche. Let us step into a realm where psychology and religion meet not as rivals, but as two ways of attending to the same mystery. How a human being makes sense of being alive, how consciousness reaches toward something larger than itself, and how symbols become doorways through which transformation can happen. In this section, we follow Carl Jung into what he called a psychology that dares to inhabit the religious dimension without surrendering to dogma. We will listen to how he spoke about symbols, myth, alchemy, and the strange, spacious phenomenon he named synchronicity. This is not merely an excursion into oddities or curiosities. It is an attempt to understand how Jung understood meaning itself in a modern, skeptical world, where science asks for reproducible results and religion asks for faith, and Jung asks for a synthesis that honors both the soul's longing and the mind's demands for coherence. First, a guiding principle, Jung's stance on religion was neither anti-rational nor anti-religious, but rather anti-reductionist. He argued that religious symbols reflect inner psychological realities rather than external dogma. In his view, the myths and rituals of cultures across time are not simply artifacts of belief systems. They are living languages of the psyche, expressions of archetypes that structure how we experience the world. A symbol in Jung's vocabulary is not merely a sign pointing toward something out there in the world. It is a self-regulating image that gathers meaning in the depths of consciousness. When a patient speaks in allegorical terms, when a dream repeats with mythic imagery, Jung is not merely translating a private fantasy into a public story. He is acknowledging that the psyche uses symbolic forms, images of the self, the anima and animus, the shadow, the great mother, the wise old man, to organize experience, to negotiate crisis, to stage a drama of transformation. The religious dimension, then, is not a mistake of the psyche to be debunked, but a map of the psyche's navigation toward wholeness. If we listen closely to Jung when he talks about religion, we hear a phrase that recurs across his work: the symbol as a bridge between inner life and outer expression. He did not deny the existence of transcendent realities. Rather, he insisted that our access to what might be called the numinous comes through symbols that originate in the psyche, and when projected outward, can appear as meaningful connections between inner state and outer events. In practical terms, Jung is inviting clinicians and lay readers to treat religious experience as a legitimate site of meaning-making, rather than as a mere delusion or irrational superstition. He does this while maintaining a rigorous respect for science, a respect that is not about denying the authority of empirical inquiry, but about recognizing its limits when it encounters the dimension of meaning, value, and ultimately, transformation. To understand Jung's stance here, one must grasp his use of the term psyche not as a ghost in the machine, but as the active, organizing center of subjectivity, the arena in which experiences are interpreted, synthesized, and converted into identity. The psyche loves patterns, it loves stories, it loves correspondences, and it uses these to create a sense of continuity in the face of disruption. Religion, for Jung, is a centuries-long laboratory in which those patterns and stories have evolved to help people face life's thresholds. Birth, illness, loss, death, and the terror and beauty of the unknown. The sacred, in his view, is not an external order that we merely discover. It is an interior order that must be lived into. The act of symbolization, seeing the world, including one's own life, through archetypal shapes, becomes a means of interior alchemy, a process by which the raw materials of experience are transformed into something capable of bearing more meaning, more resilience, more wholeness. The idea that religious symbols reflect inner realities rather than external dogma flows into Jung's most famous metaphor of transformation: alchemy. Alchemy, for Jung, is not primarily about turning lead into gold in a laboratory. It is a powerful metaphor for the inner work of becoming a whole person. The alchemical adventure, from nigrido, the blackening or decomposition, through albedo, the whitening or purification, to the tincture, the master solvent and final integrating substance, maps onto inner processes of psyche, including confrontation with the shadow, the emergence of the self, and the negotiation of paradox and unity. When Jung depicts alchemical stages, he is offering a language by which a person can imagine and follow a transformative path within the psyche. The symbol of the philosopher's stone, in Jung's framing, stands for a state of integration in which opposites are reconciled, where consciousness finds itself extended beyond the small self, and where vitality and meaning crystallize in a new wholeness. Think of it as a symbolic technology for inner change. In clinical terms, the alchemical imagery becomes a kind of internal curriculum. The patient enters a phase of confrontation with what has been neglected or repressed. The psyche disintegrates in order to reconstitute itself in a new, more luminous arrangement. Finally, the self emerges with a different center of gravity, a more stable sense of purpose, and a more capacious relationship to life's uncertainties. The appeal of symbolic alchemy, then, is not that it promises a literal, external transformation in the world, but that it offers a map for inner change, a way to narrate one's own disintegration and rebirth with a language that can hold both pain and potential. Jung's alchemical imagery is a language whose fidelity rests not in its scientific verifiability, but in its capacity to organize experience, to sustain hope, and to guide action during times of crisis when ordinary rational strategies falter. Two concrete threads in Jung's rendering of alchemy deserve emphasis as we move through this section. First, alchemy as metaphor for transformation. Second, the insistence that the outer world and inner life pursue a dialogic exchange. The psyche's content can both invade and illuminate external experience. In this sense, alchemy becomes a bridge between the subjective and the objective, between inner images and outer events, between the dream's nocturnal contents and the patient's waking decisions. The alchemical narrative is not mere fantasy. It is a structured, image-rich way of representing the psyche's dynamic attempt to become more complex, more integrated, more capable of holding paradox. A second pillar in Jung's religiously saturated psychology is his embrace of East and West as complementary sources of wisdom, not rival civilizations. Jung was not a relativist in the sense of dissolving differences between cultures into a bland sameness. He was rather a cosmopolitan diagnostician of the psyche. He observed that the symbols that arise in dreams and myths tend to recur across cultures, in different forms but with recognizable constellations of meaning. The child, the old wise man, the great mother, the hero, the trickster, the wound that must heal, the journey to the inner temple. The cross-cultural resonance of dream images and mythic motifs suggested to him that the psyche has universal structures, a kind of shared architectural blueprint that shapes how human beings experience the world and make sense of their own not yet formed wholeness. This insight brought Jung into engagement with Eastern symbols, most famously with the I Ching, the ancient Chinese divination text that offers hexagrams and interpretations rather than fixed dogmas. The I Ching became in Jung's hands a tool for exploring the psyche when faced with uncertainty, a means of eliciting a language that could reveal inner dispositions, emotional climates, and potential directions for action at moments when rational calculation seemed immobilized by ambiguity. This maximal openness toward Eastern symbols is not simply a matter of eclectic curiosity. It is a clinical and philosophical decision. If the psyche is a dynamic, archetypal system, then its expressions will not be bound to a single cultural idiom. The I Ching, in Jung's account, offered a way to hear the psyche's present moment in the language of change and interdependence. The hexagrams, with their lines in varying states of solidification and dissolution, become a living metaphor for the psyche's current posture. The question one asks matters less than the mood in which one asks it, a longing for clarity, a readiness to bear paradox, a willingness to receive guidance that does not come from external authority but from the psyche's own deep patterns. In this sense, Jung's use of the I Ching is not a simplistic endorsement of fortune-telling. It is a phenomenology of uncertainty, a method for listening to the self's emergent configurations when conventional plans falter. The third major thread in Jung's religiously tinged psychology is his own creative restatement of religious life as an ongoing act of individuation. The idea of individuation is the work of becoming a unique, integrated, whole person whose life is anchored in a center that can endure the claim of paradox. Religion, in Jung's account, becomes something like a spiritual psychology of maturation. It is not primarily about subscribing to a fixed creed. It is about entering into a relationship with the larger dimensions of life, the sacred, the numinous, the eternal, through which one's own inner landscape is clarified, deepened, and ultimately stabilized. The religious life for Jung is thus a labor of transformation, a discipline of dreams, symbols, myths, and rituals that awakens the self, consolidates the personality, and opens one to experiences that feel larger than the ordinary self and ordinary time. Within this frame, dream and myth imagery operate as universal carriers of spiritual resonance. Jung's most provocative claim is that dreams do not belong to a private realm alone. They are the psyche's way of telling us something essential about our condition, something that resonates with mythic patterns across human cultures. A dream image of a serpent, a garden, a hero who descends into a shadow world, or a figure of a wise elder can reflect spiritual experiences that in some contexts are felt as religious or quasi-religious. The cross-cultural reach of these images, whether embedded in Western biblical narratives, Eastern epic cycles, or indigenous myth, does not prove that all religion is simply projection. Rather, it reveals that the human psyche, under the pressure of life's significance and peril, tends to respond to reality in symbolic terms, and these symbolic terms, when interpreted with humility and care, can guide a person toward a more adequate grasp of self and world. A further dimension of Jung's enterprise is his insistence that inner transformation has consequences for how one engages with the world. The symbols that arise in dreams or myths cannot be simply shelved as private fantasies. They demand a response. They invite a reconfiguration of one's values, a reordering of one's commitments, a re-immersion into life with a different center of gravity. This is where the alchemical metaphor deepens into a lived spirituality. The self that emerges from the crucible of inner work has a new relationship to ordinary concerns, to religious institutions, to the ultimate concerns that Tillich would later articulate. But Jung's own formulation is not reducible to a single theological doctrine. Rather, it seeks to hold together the dignity of the religious impulse and the responsibility to face the empirical world with honesty, humility, and a sense of wonder. Let us now turn to the concept that most distinctly ties Jung's whole project to a modern sensibility: synchronicity. Synchronicity, as Jung and Pauli proposed, is a causal connecting principle that explains meaningful coincidences, events that are connected not by direct cause and effect, but by a shared meaning that seems to cross the gap between inner life and outward circumstance. The phrase itself is compact and provocative. Synchronicity is a causal connecting principle. This is not mere poetry. It is an attempt to map a phenomenon that ordinary science, with its insistence on covariation and causal links, tends to overlook or deny. Jung did not claim that every coincidence is meaningful, nor that all meaningful coincidences have unconscious significance. Rather, he argued that in some cases, the psyche appears to be in a certain alignment with external events in such a way that the match cannot be explained by a purely causal chain. When a dream image resonates with an actual event, or when a symbol arises in a person's life at precisely the moment a relevant decision must be faced, Jung asks us to attend not only to what happened, but to what the event means for the individual's process of becoming. Let's ground this with 3 concrete examples that Jung himself would recognize as emblematic of his broader project. The first example is the appeal of symbolic alchemy as a map for inner change. In clinical practice, Jung would invite a patient to engage with alchemical imagery as a way of narrating the inner drama of transformation. The blackening, the purification, the rebirth, these stages are not literal events but symbolic diagrams of psychic work. A patient might dream of a stone turning to gold, of a body dissolving into liquid, or of a chamber filled with a radiant, healing light. These are not passive pictures. They are invitations to attend to what is dying, what is disintegrating, and what is newly arising. The alchemical language gives the patient permission to inhabit a space where the self can be broken open without losing coherence, where pain can be borne because it is seen as a preparation for a higher degree of integration. The map works because it encodes a time-tested mythic pedagogy: death as a doorway, rebirth as a practical possibility, wholeness as a horizon that requires patient, sometimes arduous work. The alchemical map has also served as a bridge for patients who feel estranged from conventional religious language. The symbols carry ethical and existential weight without requiring adherence to particular doctrinal forms. They allow meaning to be shaped by life's pressures rather than by inherited creeds. The second example centers on Jung's use of the I Ching as a tool for exploring the psyche in the face of uncertainty. In 1959, Jung published the I Ching, or Book of Changes, a volume that presents his interpretation of the ancient Chinese text not as a fortune-telling manual, but as a patient and reverent instrument for engaging the unconscious. He argued that the I Ching's hexagrams, patterns of 6 lines that shift in response to questions, offer a language that can help reveal the current mood of the psyche and point toward directions of growth or clarification. The process is not deterministic, it is dialogical. The hexagram serves as a mirror, not a verdict. In moments when a person must decide, when options are multiple and the emotional climate is unsettled, consulting the I Ching becomes an opportunity to encounter the psyche's own structures in a form that can be reflected upon with a degree of humility and openness. Jung's willingness to embrace an Eastern method in the West, to treat an ancient divinatory practice as a legitimate instrument of introspection, stands as a historical signal. Jung was not interested in preserving the aura of a single tradition, but in testing the universal reach of the psyche's symbolic language. The I Ching, for Jung, offered a concrete case of cross-cultural dialogue in the service of inner understanding. It is a real-world application that many therapists have since explored, a tool that respects ambiguity, invites reflection, and anchors spiritual questions in a method that remains testable in the clinic by attentive listening and patient self-reliance. The third example concerns dream and myth imagery that resonates with spiritual experiences across cultures. Jung's work repeatedly returns to the dream's richness and the myth's endurance as evidence that spiritual experiences do not belong to one narrow domain. They belong to a shared human repertoire that languages truth through images rather than propositional statements alone. Across cultures, dream motifs, such as journeys into the underworld, encounters with luminous beings, tests that must be passed, and reunions with figures who promise guidance, often carry a sense of dwelling within an order greater than the ego. The myth of the hero who descends to confront the numinous, the journey toward a hidden temple, the appearance of a guiding mentor in the guise of an old man or a goddess, these are not mere cultural echo chambers. They are episodes in which people experience states of consciousness that feel spiritually charged, a recognition that life holds layers beyond the immediate, and a trust that the psyche's own vision can lead toward a more expansive sense of belonging and purpose. Jung's insistence on cross-cultural resonance here is not naive universalism. It is a phenomenology of how the psyche, in its longing for meaning, organizes experience in patterns that will feel familiar to the human reader regardless of the cultural frame. Let us pause with two brief historical notes that illuminate how Jung pursued this blending of symbol, myth, and spirituality across different intellectual landscapes. The first anecdote concerns Jung's engagement with Eastern symbols. In the mid-20th century, Jung's engagement with Eastern thought deepened in a public manner, most visibly through his work on the I Ching and through his reflections on Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist imagery that surfaced in his discussions of archetypes and the self. This was not a superficial borrowing from another tradition. It was an invitation to test whether the psyche's deepest motifs could be found in the idioms of multiple cultures, and whether those idioms could illuminate a shared process of psychological growth. The East offered Jung a vocabulary that could articulate the dynamics of transformation with a language that often evaded lexical capture within Western dogma. He found in the I Ching a living manual for interpreting uncertainty, not a fixed system predicting outcomes. The encounter with Eastern symbols widened the horizon of Jungian psychology. It did not erase the value of Western myth, but it grew a cosmopolitan seriousness about the universal shapes of the psyche. The second anecdote concerns the late-career expansion of Jung's spiritual psychology and the publication of the Red Book as a personal mythic archive. The Red Book, or Liber Novus, is a sprawling, vivid manuscript Jung wrote and illustrated between 1913 and the early 1930s, a deeply personal record of dreams, visions, dialogues with figures he describes as inner teachers, and a dramatic exploration of the psyche's inner landscapes. Though Jung never presented this work as a completed theory, its material reveals a lifelong commitment to the sacred imagination as a genuine subject of serious inquiry. The Red Book remained largely unavailable to the public for decades after Jung's death, until it finally appeared in 2009, revealing to readers a private archive that shows the fullness of his interior spiritual exploration. The publication was not merely sensational because it was newly available. It reframed a portion of Jung's career as a man who, even at the margins of clinical theory, followed the impulse to narrate the psyche's encounters with archetypal forces in the language of myth, symbol, and vision. It is not simply a curious footnote. It is the documentary heart of a life spent insisting that meaning is not a relic of the past, but an ongoing experiential horizon. These two anecdotes, the encounter with Eastern symbols and the late career uncovering of the Red Book, mark a pattern in Jung's work, a willingness to enlarge the boundaries of psychology by listening to the world's symbolic languages, while keeping a steady eye on the inner demands of individuation and transformation. They also illuminate the way Jung insisted that the psyche's life of symbol and myth is not a private subject only for scholars of dreams. It is a source of guidance, courage, and epistemic humility in an age that trusts neither dogma nor reductionism to answer life's central questions. We are now prepared to examine two major lines of critique that have accompanied Jung's most ambitious claims. The first counterargument concerns synchronicity itself. Critics have challenged the scientific status of a principle that claims to account for meaningful coincidences without causal links. They argue that synchronicity resembles a post hoc narrative that gives the appearance of meaning after the fact, not a phenomenon that can be tested or falsified. From this perspective, synchronicity risks becoming a kind of metaphysical reassurance that substitutes subjective meaning for objective explanation. If a meaningful coincidence occurs, the natural impulse is to interpret it as significant. If it does not, the interpretation is not compelled. In either case, the critique goes, the claim that a coincidence demonstrates a real acausal connection is difficult to defend in the terms of empirical science, and it invites the danger of confirmation bias. The psychotherapist's temptation is to see patterns where the psyche is simply mapping its needs onto stochastic events in the external world. The worry is that the allure of synchronicity supports credence for magical thinking and invites unwarranted interpretive authority into clinical settings. The solution offered by skeptics is to maintain a critical stance, to acknowledge subjective resonance while insisting that causal explanations remain the primary framework for understanding events in the natural world, except when genuine, replicable evidence for acausal connections can be established. The second counterargument concerns religious misappropriation or essentializing spirituality. Jung's approach runs the risk, some critics say, of reducing religion to psychic phenomena or of twisting the authentic plurality of religious experience into a single, archetypal grammar. If the psyche's symbolic life becomes the master framework for understanding religion, there is a danger that the specific historical, social, and doctrinal dimensions of religious traditions are flattened into images of the inner self. Religions are not only personal journeys, they are shaped by communities, institutions, histories, texts, moral commitments, and transformative events in the world. Critics worry that Jung's method can mask these dimensions by presenting symbols that, while psychologically persuasive, may fail to capture the integrity of religious communities or the ethical demands those communities articulate. The concern extends to the possibility that symbolic interpretation, while richly illuminating, might inadvertently absorb the political and social elements of religion into the intimate drama of individuation, thereby downplaying the power of collective life to generate and sustain meaning beyond the individual. Refusing to shore up either of these critiques with a simplistic rebuttal, Jung's defenders would respond that the calls for science and for historical religious particularity are not enemies, but partners in a mature quest for wisdom. Synchronicity, for instance, does not claim to supplant causal science, but to illuminate a different order of meaningful connection that operates alongside causality. It is an invitation to consider the possibility that the psyche and the world sometimes reflect each other in a way that cannot be captured by a purely linear account of cause and effect. The challenge for clinicians, then, is to steward this possibility with disciplined humility, to acknowledge the experiential reality of meaningful coincidence while remaining vigilant about overinterpretation, about projecting one's own needs onto events, and about confusing correlation with a metaphysical law. The critique of science remains essential, but so does the non-reductionist impulse to honor experiences of meaning that resist easy explanation. The challenge for the religious angle, likewise, is to preserve the integrity and particularity of specific spiritual communities, even as we acknowledge that Jung's approach offers a language capable of articulating what many people feel when they encounter the sacred within themselves. In other words, the opposition is not between a scientifically grounded psychology and a spiritually meaningful religion. It is between a narrowly reductionist science and a symbol-rich psychology that seeks to accompany the person through both crisis and awe. With these tensions acknowledged, let us widen the lens to consider how Jung's ideas have been taken up, translated, or transformed in modern contexts. We can see his influence in conversations about spirituality within psychotherapy and in secular humanistic psychology, fields that increasingly recognize that meaning, value, and transcendence belong in the repertoire of therapeutic concerns. Jung's insistence that the psyche seeks wholeness resonates with contemporary discussions of meaning-making as a core therapeutic aim. Therapists working in the existential and humanistic traditions emphasize that patients come to therapy not only with problems of symptom relief but with questions about life's purpose, about how to navigate suffering, and about how to live with a sense of personal significance. In this sense, Jung helps validate the spiritual dimension of psychotherapy while insisting that spirituality is not reducible to doctrinal belief or to an ideological system. The modern therapeutic world often uses language that echoes Jung's emphasis on inner transformation and the centrality of symbol. Meaning is something one actively constructs in narrative form, in ritual-like practices of self-encounter, and in the cultivation of attention to dreams, myths, and moments of self-transcendence. To illuminate cross-references further, consider Mircea Eliade, who wrote about sacred space and the manifestation of the sacred in time and space. Where Jung speaks of inner transformation through symbol, Eliade speaks of the sacred appearing in the world as hierophany, a breaking into ordinary reality by a more than ordinary reality that demands reverence and ritual response. The two are not diametric opposites, they illuminate different dimensions of religious life. Eliade's claim that the sacred breaks through to reconstitute the individual's orientation in the world complements Jung's insistence that the psyche itself generates forms of meaning that can reorganize a life. The contrast highlights a fruitful conversation. The sacred can be seen as a dimension that calls forth symbol and rite in communities, the Eliadean frame, while the psyche can be seen as the site in which those experiences are processed, elaborated, and tested for personal growth, the Jungian frame. When we hold both in view, we can appreciate how religious life can be simultaneously a public, communal phenomenon and a private, transformative journey. Paul Tillich's concept of ultimate concern provides another meaningful bridge. Tillich famously defined religion as the ultimate concern, a stance that answers the demand for ultimate meaning with conviction, risk, and the possibility of surrender to something larger than oneself. Jung's project in this light can be read as offering a psychological practice that helps a person encounter and live with that ultimate concern in a way that is psychologically sustainable. The question then becomes not whether the ultimate concern is real in an objective sense, but whether the person's life can be oriented by such a concern in a way that fosters courage, responsibility, and ethical living. Jung's symbol work offers a language and a practice to sustain such a concern in a life that also demands empirical accountability, social responsibility, and a critical stance toward blind belief. Tillich's emphasis on courage in the face of existential anxiety resonates with Jung's insistence that the journey of individuation, though fraught with danger and ambiguity, remains the most genuine response to the deepest demands of human life. In contemporary discussions of spirituality within psychotherapy and secular humanistic psychology, Jung's legacy is often invoked as a precursor to a more nuanced understanding of meaning, spirituality, and ritual in modern life. The field has moved beyond a strict dichotomy between science and religion toward a posture that recognizes the human need for transcendence, awe, and connection as legitimate domains of healing and growth. This shift has led to practical applications. Clinicians incorporate sacred or symbolic language with care, offering clients choices about whether to engage with rituals, myths, or contemplative practices that are compatible with their beliefs or lack thereof. They can explore dreams with a symbolic lens, pay attention to mythic motifs in the client's personal story, and consider the role of directed attention, mindfulness-like practices, or liturgical-inspired acts that can anchor a sense of meaning. The aim is not to baptize psychology as religion, nor to strip religion of its social or ethical weight, but to cultivate a form of therapy that respects both the depths of the unconscious and the responsibilities of living within a shared world. We now enter three more tangible illustrations that illuminate how Jung's ideas function in real life beyond the clinic, across fields like literature, art, and personal spiritual practice. The first is a broader cultural resonance, the enduring appeal of myth as a source of modern spiritual experience. In literature and film, mythic patterns, journeys that mirror the descent into one's own interior depths, figures who provide guidance or tests, portraits of transformation, continue to emerge as a language through which audiences interpret the world. The second is a contemporary interest in cross-cultural spirituality in psychotherapy. As therapists and researchers recognize that clients bring to therapy a range of spiritual orientations, some organized by religious tradition, others more diffuse or personal, there is an increasing openness to symbol-based, meaning-centered approaches that do not require a particular creed. The third is the ongoing discussion about inner life and secular spirituality, the sense that one can live a life of meaning, moral seriousness, gratitude, and awe without subscribing to a traditional religious institution. Jung's framework provides a vocabulary, archetypes, symbols, the self, the process of individuation, that helps people articulate experiences that might otherwise feel solitary, irrational, or destabilizing. The offend then of his thought is not, accept this or you will be unhappy. It is a philosophy of life that invites careful listening to the inner weather and patient cultivation of an interior climate that can sustain action in the outer world. In this exploration, we must acknowledge a stubborn tension at the heart of Jung's project. On one hand, he offers a language of meaning that can feel deeply true for many people who live in a modern, plural, and often secular world. On the other hand, there is the risk that a psychological interpretation of religion can reinscribe the very concerns that many faith traditions have historically contested. The reduction of spiritual claim to inner state, the risk of private mysticism that erodes communal and historical accountability, and the danger that symbols become tools for enforcing personal comfort while ignoring broader ethical obligations to society and to those most vulnerable. The challenge is not to choose between affirming the psyche's depth and honoring the social dimension of religious life, but to seek a balance that respects both, to allow the psyche to breathe within a larger ecology of meaning, moral accountability, and communal responsibility. As you reflect on this landscape, let me invite you to consider three cross-cutting questions that can ground your own engagement with Jung's ideas. First, how do we distinguish between a meaningful correspondence that expands our understanding of life and a pattern-seeking impulse that risks overinterpretation? What practices can help us distinguish genuine synchronistic resonance from the human propensity to find order in randomness? Second, in what ways can symbol and ritual be integrated into contemporary clinical work without erasing the crucial social historical texture of religious traditions? How can therapists honor clients' spiritual identities while remaining faithful to the plural and evolving nature of religious life in pluralistic societies? Third, how can Jung's alchemy become a practical pedagogy for contemporary transformation, one that respects both inner development and outer responsibility? How can the image of transformation be mobilized not as an escape from pain, but as a disciplined invitation to suffer bravely for growth and healing? To bring these questions alive, let me offer a few practical paths some readers and viewers might explore. One path is to use alchemical imagery as a reflective practice in daily life. You might keep an inner diary where you map times of crisis as moments of negrito, times when old patterns are breaking down as moments of putrefaction, and times of insight or renewed vitality as moments of tincture. The aim would not be to falsify or romanticize your experience, but to cultivate a narrative of growth that honors ambivalence and complexity. A second path is to engage with cross-cultural symbolic material as a partner to your own experiences, not as a dogmatic substitute for belief, but as a language in which you can test the meaning of what you encounter. Reading Jung alongside translations of the I Ching or Eastern mythic material can illuminate how different cultures articulate the same interior processes. A third path is to practice a form of dream work that remains attuned to ethical life. Dreams can become a laboratory for testing how inner images might inform how we relate to others, how we confront fear or anger, and how we imagine new modes of living in relation to the world. In all of these, the aim is not to secure certainty, but to cultivate discernment, courage, and care. Let us close with a final meditation on a line of thought that, for Jung, binds religion, myth, alchemy, and synchronicity into a single pursuit. Meaning-making as a lifelong discipline. Jung's project is not to replace religious faith with psychological insight, nor to sanctify psychology as religion. Rather, it is to acknowledge that human beings do not live by facts alone, nor by fables alone, but by a contested terrain where facts and symbols, science and myth, reason and reverie, must converse in a steady, often uncomfortable, but eternally hopeful dialogue. When we read Jung, we encounter a mind that refuses to surrender to cynicism about the sacred, yet refuses to pretend that the sacred can be reduced to any one doctrine, creed, or laboratory finding. He invites us to hold in suspension the tension between what we can prove and what we must believe in order to continue to grow. He invites us to imagine the psyche as a living universe that, through symbols, dreams, and the occasional chance encounter that seems to bite with significance, continues its work of healing and becoming. In the end, Jung's approach to religion, myth, alchemy, and synchronicity is not a doctrine but a method, a way of teaching attention, interpretation, and responsibility. It is a pedagogy of courage. It asks us to notice the small signs that invite a larger understanding, to listen for the patterns that emerge across different lives and different ages, to test the boundaries of what we know with humility rather than certainty, and to recognize that meaning itself is a posture we cultivate, a way of living with humility before what exceeds our ordinary grasp, and a readiness to respond with generosity, integrity, and care. If we learn to inhabit this posture, the modern world need not be an empty arena of secular progress alone, nor a fortress of dogmatic certainty. It can be, in Jung's generous sense, a field of meaning in which the inner and outer worlds echo one another, where a dream's image can point toward a future we can responsibly inhabit, where synchronicity can remind us that the universe is not a random tumble of events, but a network of relationships that invites us to become more fully who we are meant to be. And if we listen carefully, we may hear in Jung's work not the triumph of a single creed, but the mature hope that, through symbol, story, and disciplined attention, human beings can continue to grow toward a unity that respects both the mystery that surrounds us and the light that resides within. Snooze philosophy invites you to settle in, to slow your breathing, and to listen with the patience of someone who knows that the deepest questions rarely hurry. In this segment, we turn to Carl Jung, the psychologist who refused to let the mind stay confined to the laboratory or the clinic, who insisted that myth, symbol, and dream are not escape routes from reality, but rather routes toward its deeper strata. We ask, what has Jung's thought endured, where has it been challenged, and how does it keep finding new life in psychology, art, literature, and everyday life? We will trace the arc from his origins as a disciple who diverged from Freud, through his central claims, the collective unconscious, archetypes, individuation, and the language of symbols, and into the complex reception of his ideas in the late 20th century and beyond. We will listen for the echoes Jung believed reality itself makes when seen through the lens of symbol and dream, and we will also listen for the critique that speaks in a different key. Can such universals as archetypes really be measured? Do gendered categories and cultural borrowings overstep ethical boundaries? And what happens when a psychological theory becomes a cultural grammar, shaping how stories are told and how we tell ourselves who we are? To begin with, a short remembrance of origins. Jung did not begin as a distant theorist predicting the shapes of the psyche from a safe chair. He began in the intimate pressure of clinical work, in collaboration and contest with Freud, and in the later discovery that there was more to the mind's life than the narrow economy of drive and metabolism that Freud had emphasized. The famous split with Freud, often dramatized as a rupture in a friendship or a feud over libido and causality, was also a philosophical separation. Jung urged a broader map of psyche, one that could accommodate myth, symbol, spiritual experience, and modes of meaning that could not be fully captured in a theory of instincts and reproduction. He argued that the psyche possessed layers that did not originate in personal experience alone, but carried within them relics of humanity's ancestral life. In his own words and in the language he often returns to, the psyche is not merely a private theater, but a living citadel that houses the past and the present. The archetypes, he claimed, are not learned from parents or culture alone. They are the inherited templates of perception, the forms of the collective unconscious, which render human experience comprehensible across different societies and epochs. The archetype is not a stereotype you memorize, but a predisposition that shapes the way a person, if unconsciously, understands and shapes the world. If we press what Jung called the collective unconscious, we find that he believed the mind contains structures more ancient than the individual's biography. The personal unconscious includes forgotten experiences, repressed memories, and unresolved complexes. The collective unconscious, by contrast, stores those motifs that recur across cultures. The mother, the hero, the trickster, the shadow, the wise old man, the anima and animus. The language of Jung's archetypes is a language of symbolic figures rather than literal templates. They appear in dreams and myths, in art and ritual, and they reappear in literature and film long after the original source of the image has faded from memory. The archetypes are not just mental pictures. They are also the energy that animates perception, the force that calls forth certain kinds of responses, the levers that move us toward or away from certain kinds of meaning. As Jung puts it in the debates of his time and in the later restatement of his theory, archetypes are psychic dispositions that predispose the brain to form certain kinds of images. They are not arbitrary inventions but natural forms that help the psyche to organize experience into comprehensible patterns. In that sense, Jung's project was not to dethrone the modern mind's rationality, but to widen it. He embraced a plural theory of human life, the rational, the irrational, the spiritual, and the symbolic. He invited psychology to pivot toward questions about meaning, about why certain images recur across cultures, about what it means to encounter a dream and feel that the dream speaks with a voice that seems older than the speaker. This is where Jung intersects with many currents in 20th century thought, with the existential insistence that meaning is something the subject must actively confront, with the phenomenology of perception that asks how experience is given to consciousness rather than simply what experience is, and with literary and artistic practices that insist myth and symbol shape perception as surely as perception shapes the world. From these beginnings, Jung's influence proliferated into multiple domains. In psychology, depth psychology, an umbrella term for approaches that emphasize the unconscious and the hidden determinants of behavior, found in Jung a robust counterweight to a purely behaviorist or strictly cognitive psychology. In art and literature, Jung offered a language to talk about images, motifs, and patterns that could be traced across cultures and genres. In popular culture, Jung's ideas moved from clinical notes into the air of everyday conversation. Archetype became a familiar term, shadow work a shared practice, and individuation a goal that sounded both personal and cosmic. The forces that shaped Jung's life, myth, alchemy, religious symbolism, the psychology of the dream, found a new audience that did not necessarily seek clinical cure but sought to understand the shape of the self as it intersects with history, culture, and art. To understand the contemporary reception, it helps to think of three faces Jung's thought wears in the modern world. First, there is the archetypal, image-driven aspect. Archetypes are, in practice, the familiar figures that actors and writers return to again and again because they resonate with something ancient and shared within us. The hero who rises to face the challenge, the mentor who offers guidance, the shadow self that embodies what the hero refuses to admit, the anima and animus that mediate between gendered modes of subjectivity. These figures are embedded in film scripts, novels, comic books, and advertising campaigns. The enduring appeal of archetypes in film, literature, and branding, to name one broad sphere, is not a mere curiosity. It is a testimony to Jung's claim that certain patterns of meaning are common to the human psyche. The second face is the depth psychology face, the practice and culture of exploring the psyche through symbols, through dreams, through guided imagination, through group work and art therapy. Here Jung's legacy is not merely theoretical. It is procedural. Therapists, counselors, and educators have borrowed his vocabulary to assist people in encountering their inner landscapes, in identifying patterns, and in cultivating a sense of self that can stand in relation to others. The third face is the critical, evolutionary, and historical one. Jung's thought after his lifetime is constantly reinterpreted, reworked, sometimes watered down, sometimes radicalized. Archetypal psychology, for instance, is not simply a repetition of Jung's original claims. It is a development by James Hillman that reframes archetypes as living, autonomous forms in the psyche that animate images and events in ways that are at once personal and cosmic. And Jungian-inspired narrative approaches, an approach to literature and film that treats mythic structures as structural scaffolding guiding plot, character, and meaning, have become a common tool in literary studies and screen analysis. The enduring influence of Jung is perhaps most visible in three interlocking domains. First, the ongoing use and reinterpretation of archetypes in culture and commerce. Second, the expansion of depth psychology into therapeutic practice and group work. And third, the development of new intellectual currents that extend Jung's core ideas into novel theoretical directions. Let us turn to each of these domains with attention to both their promise and their limitations. The first domain concerns the archetypal language itself, how archetypes operate as shapes of meaning that recur across media and culture. In film, literature, and branding, archetypes appear as recognizable patterns that help audiences anticipate, interpret, and emotionally engage with stories and products. The hero's journey is perhaps the most famous template associated with Jung's influence, but it is only a starting point. Jung's idea that the psyche gravitates towards certain recurring images means that a film might invite the viewer to recognize a familiar constellation of figures and tensions. The hero, the mentor, the shadow, the quest, the return. When a director places a hero at the center of a quest whose stages mirror a well-known mythic arc, audiences sense not merely a plot, but a psychic invitation to participate in a drama of becoming. In this sense, Jung's influence is not about forced allegory or simplistic symbolism. It is about a recognition that certain symbolic forms travel across cultures and time because they tap into something shared in human subjectivity. The enduring appeal of archetypal motifs in cinema and literature can be traced through the long lines of criticism and popular reception that Red works through the lens of myth and symbol. Consider, for example, the sweeping mythic resonances in Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker's journey resembles the heroic arc of mythic figures from antiquity, with mentors offering aid, trials testing the hero, the temptation to abandon the mission, the confrontation with the dark side, and the eventual return to a wiser state of balance. The mentor figure mirrors the archetype of the wise elder. The confrontation with the shadow echoes in the Darth Vader revelation, and the entire narrative scaffolding resonates with the Jungian sense that personal growth unfolds through a confrontation with deeper, often hidden, forces within the psyche. But Jung's influence runs beyond cinema. In branding and consumer culture, archetypes become strategic tools. Marketers and designers frequently map products and campaigns onto archetypal patterns that customers subconsciously recognize and identify with. A company might present itself as a hero brand that promises courage and triumph, or as a caregiver brand that signals nurturing and trust, or as a sage brand that promises wisdom and guidance. When a brand speaks in terms of archetypes, it is not merely selling a product. It is inviting a consumer into a mythic narrative in which identity and aspiration become inseparable from consumption. In such uses, Jung's insight that images have powers beyond the literal content of a message becomes a practical tool for shaping cultural experience. Critics may push back, arguing that reducing complex human experience to archetypes risks oversimplification or manipulation. Yet the counterargument is that archetypes, when acknowledged as motifs rather than deterministic molds, can illuminate why certain stories feel compelling across disparate cultures and eras. They explain the persistence of certain motifs, rags to riches, pilgrimages, quests for knowledge, forbidden loves, that recur in ways that feel both familiar and transformative. The second domain, the rise of depth psychology and its influence on art therapy, psychotherapy, and group work, emerges more directly from Jung's clinical sensibilities. Jung's insistence that the psyche contains autonomous, self-regulating processes that organize experience under a symbolic logic opened doors for practices that emphasize image, symbol, and myth as legitimate pathways to healing. In art therapy, clients express inner life through painting, sculpture, or collage, offering material that can be interpreted not in the narrow sense of what the client means, but through the symbolic syntax that the psyche uses to represent unresolved conflict, trauma, or longing. In Jung's framework, the artwork becomes a dialogic medium in which the client encounters inner figures, the shadow, the anima or animus, the self as a mandala-like center, and the therapist, rather than imposing a predetermined interpretation, accompanies the patient as an analyst of symbols. Dreams, too, play a central role in Jungian practice. Dream interpretation in Jungian therapy attends to the symbolic content, the emergence of archetypal figures, and the process by which dream material can integrate with waking life to support individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a more complete and differentiated person. It is not merely that dreams convey hidden truths, it is that dreams stage a symbolic dialogue between the conscious ego and the larger psyche, offering a path toward balance, wholeness, and the integration of dissonant parts of the self. Group work inspired by Jungian and post-Jungian theory takes the same symbolic lens into social and relational contexts. In group analysis and group psychotherapy, the group itself becomes a living field in which archetypal dynamics, power, authority, rejection, belonging, scapegoating play themselves out. The therapist's work in such settings involves recognizing collective patterns, naming them, and guiding participants to transform them through conscious reflection and symbolic exploration. The aim is not to eliminate conflict, but to transform it through insight and shared meaning. In educational and clinical settings, Jungian-inspired approaches have encouraged the use of narrative, image-making, and ritual as ways to facilitate emotional processing, empathy, and resilience. Critiques of depth psychology complicate this picture. Some argue that Jungian methods rely too much on interpretation and subjective experience and can lack the rigorous empirical grounding that contemporary psychotherapy demands. Others praise the approach for its capacity to reach experiences that resist quantitative measurement and to offer accessible, compassionate language for those who struggle with the more technocratic language of some forms of psychotherapy. The debate, then, is not whether Jungian ideas can be useful, but under what conditions they are ethically and clinically appropriate, and how they interface with other modalities that emphasize evidence-based practice. The third domain, more theoretical, more speculative, and perhaps more contested, concerns later developments such as archetypal psychology and Jungian-inspired narrative approaches. Archetypal psychology, most clearly associated with James Hillman, takes Jung's archetypes as living, autonomous energies in the psyche rather than fixed templates that structure every perception. Hillman relocates the focus from the psyche as a problem to be solved to the psyche as a living, moral field that has its own voice and agency. This shift has been both celebrated and contested within Jungian circles. Proponents argue that archetypal psychology opens space for an ethical and aesthetic dimension of psyche, where images carry moral weight, and where therapy can become a form of dialogue with the inner figures rather than a mapping exercise to correct deficiencies. Critics worry that this emphasis risks drifting away from clinical accountability or from the existential reality of distress in ways that cannot be captured by symbol alone. And then there are Jungian-inspired narrative approaches, ways of reading literature and analyzing film that treat plots, characters, and motifs as manifestations of archetypal energy. In this view, a novel's plot might resemble a mythic journey, and a scene might carry the weight of a symbolic rite. The benefit of this method is that it can illuminate how stories function as a cultural technology for shaping desire, fear, and aspiration. The caution is that such an approach can overinterpret art's complexity, imposing a psychological schema that may overlook historical, social, and authorial decisions that produce a text's meaning in valuable but non-psychological ways. To hold these claims together while acknowledging their limits, consider an example from film criticism and literary theory that shows Jung's ongoing cross-pollination with other intellectual currents. A Jungian lens has often been used to read the figure of the trickster in literature and film, a figure that complicates moral order and reveals the psyche's appetite for paradox, ambiguity, and transformation. In this sense, Jung meets postmodern critique in the sense that he insists on the irreducible complexity of human motivation and symbol, while postmodern theory cautions against grand narratives and totalizing systems. The result is both tension and fertile dialogue. Jung's insistence on a symbolic economy of the psyche can be read as a grand narrative in its own right, yet his emphasis on interior experience and the multiplicity of meanings anticipates postmodern pluralism in important ways. And in literary theory and popular culture, Jung's ideas have become part of a toolkit for exploring mythic resonance, symbolic depth, and the human longing for meaning. In the language of psychoanalytic and literary criticism, Jung's influence is felt in the long tradition of myth criticism, in the fascination with the psychological depths of characters, and in the cultivation of interpretive practices that attend to dream, symbol, and image as legitimate carriers of truth. Now, before we drift too comfortably into praise, we must acknowledge counterarguments that have haunted Jungian thought from its earliest days to the present. The first counterargument concerns empirical challenges to the universality and measurability of archetypes. If archetypes are supposed to be universal templates residing in the collective unconscious, how do we test their ubiquity across cultures, ages, and languages? How can we validate that a particular figure, say the mother, the hero, the trickster, exists as a universal pattern rather than as a literary or cultural construction? Critics point to cross-cultural psychology and anthropology that highlight significant variations in mythic motifs and symbolic systems. They argue that archetypes may capture something real about human experience, an experiential constancy in how people respond emotionally to certain situations, but the claim that they are universal, inherited structures accessible to all minds may overreach the data. They push for more precise definitions, more careful empirical testing, and more explicit differentiation between archetypal motifs and culture-bound expressions of those motifs. They remind us that what feels universal in one cultural lexicon might be particular in another's symbolic grammar. The upshot is not that Jung's ideas are invalid, but that their status as universal, innate templates requires ongoing scrutiny, cross-cultural research, and a careful distinction between the universality of emotional experiences and the contextual variation of symbolic forms. The second broad counterargument concerns gender essentialism and cultural appropriation. Jung's gender language, archetypes such as anima and animus, the feminine and masculine inner figures, and the way these inner feminine and masculine energies interact with outer gender roles, has drawn intense critique. Some feminists and post-colonial critics argue that Jung's typology reinforces binary gender norms and reinforces a particular Western male gaze about women's and men's psychic life. They argue that the anima and animus, in particular, can encode essentialist notions about masculine and feminine psychology that risk reifying stereotypes rather than interrogating them. They also raise concerns about cultural appropriation. Jung drew on a global repertoire, Eastern mysticism, alchemical images, indigenous and ancient symbols, in ways that may exoticize or instrumentalize other cultures for the sake of a psychological framework. The concern is not only about accuracy, but about ethics and respect for the integrity of other traditions. Critics warn that a Jungian framework can function as a cultural translator that divorces symbols from their original cultural context, turning them into mere tools for Western psychological aims. The response to this critique comes in multiple forms. Some insist on a more nuanced, critical approach to cultural borrowings, recognizing the power and limitations of symbolic language across cultures, while others reframe Jung's materials in ways that foreground ethical engagement with other cultures or pivot to mutual influence rather than appropriation. The dialogue remains productive because it compels Jungian practitioners to reflect on how symbol, myth, and archetype are used, who benefits from their use, and how to maintain humility about the limits of one's own cultural horizon. If we widen the horizon to include cross-references to Freudian psychoanalysis, existential phenomenology, and postmodern critiques of grand narratives, these conversations become richer and more complicated, and also more illuminating for contemporary audiences. Freudian psychoanalysis and Jungian depth psychology share a family resemblance in their interest in unconscious processes, but they diverge in what they take to be the central engines of distress and growth. Freud's emphasis on sexuality, early development, and unconscious drives as the root of neurosis stands in tension with Jung's insistence on the wider symbolic life of the psyche and the potential for growth through meaningful engagement with symbols, dreams, and myth. The Freudian legacy, then, is the insistence on looking below the surface of conscious life for determinants of behavior. Jung adds to this a philosophically robust invitation to consider how meaning itself arises and how individuals might align more closely with the deeper realms of the psyche through a process of self-discovery and integration. The Freudian framework remains indispensable in many clinical contexts, but Jung's contribution widens the horizon of what it means to be human. Existential phenomenology, with its emphasis on lived experience, authenticity, and the encounter with the thing in itself of existence, resonates with Jung's insistence that the psyche is not simply a warehouse of memories or a mechanism of defense. Both traditions value the experiential givenness of human life, and both resist the reduction of the self to a mere function of biology or social conditioning. Jung, in dialogue with existential concerns, can be read as offering a map for negotiating authenticity in the face of numinous, even frightening, dimensions of experience, the sense that there is more to life than the merely practical or instrumentally useful. Postmodern critiques of grand narratives offer a different kind of pressure. They challenge the claim that there exist universal, stable structures, whether archetypes or archetypal images, that can neatly organize human experience across cultures. They remind us that narratives of wholeness and integration can slide into normative visions of human life, once again projecting a particular worldview as if it were universal. In response, Jungian thought often emphasizes pluralism and ambiguity. The singular mythic arc need not erase difference. And yet the critique remains. If archetypes function as universal scripts, how do we account for counter-narratives, marginal experiences, and cultural pluralities? Some modern Jungian and post-Jungian writers have tried to meet this challenge by reframing archetypes as dynamic energies within a living psyche that interacts with history, culture, and personal development. The result is an approach that can honor the symbolic life without collapsing it into a universal blueprint that erases difference. In literary theory and popular culture, Jung's influence is often channeled through an overture to myth, symbol, and dream, while acknowledging the historical contingency of symbols themselves. The dialogue among Freud, Jung, existential thinkers, and postmodern critics thus remains a living conversation, one that continues to test the resilience and relevance of Jung's insights in a world of plural perspectives. In the many forums where Jung's ideas have become practically operative, two anecdotes illuminate the contemporary purchase of Jungian thought. The first is the late 20th century popularization of Jung's vocabulary in a broader self-help and spiritual milieu. In the wake of a cultural moment that sought to integrate psychology with personal growth, Jung's language of the shadow, the self, and individuation gained traction beyond clinic doors. People who may not have taken a course in psychology or read a clinical text nonetheless encountered terms like shadow work, inner dialogue, and integration in popular books, workshops, and talk shows. The metaphorical economy of Jung's symbols offered a framework for confronting personal fear, trauma, and the conflict between social roles and inner life. It was not merely a matter of private therapy. Jungian terms had become portable currency in the culture of self-exploration, the language with which people described the struggles and possibilities of becoming more whole. In this late 20th century phase, Jung's ideas often intersected with other streams of thought: humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, and the burgeoning interest in spirituality outside established religious institutions. The effect was to reposition Jung not only as a clinical theorist but as a cultural interlocutor, someone whose ideas could be used, debated, even appropriated, in service of personal meaning-making in a secular or loosely spiritual milieu. The lingering question, of course, is whether this popularization retained the nuance and ethical seriousness of Jung's original project. It is fair to say that some of Jung's complexity risked being simplified into a set of easily grasped phrases or reimagined myths, while other readers discovered in the simplified forms a doorway to a more nuanced encounter with symbols and dreams. The second anecdote centers on the 2009 release of the Red Book, Liber Novus, which expanded public access to Jung's inner life in a way that few psychiatrists or religious thinkers could have anticipated. The Red Book is not a clinical manual. It is a century-spanning diary of the psyche's exploration through visions, dreams, drawings, and reflections. Its publication sent a ripple through the academic and popular worlds. It offered a window into Jung's own process of grappling with the contents of the psyche, including the struggles, failures, and breakthroughs that accompanied his theoretical development. The public reception was electric for several reasons. First, readers encountered Jung not merely as a clinical innovator, but as someone who wrestled with spiritual questions in a direct, intimate, and aesthetically rich way. The journal-like passages and the vivid illustrations presented a counterweight to the more sterile clinical image of Jung as the psychologist of the collective unconscious. Second, the Red Book reframed Jung's life story as a narrative about a scientist who confronted the depths of his own psyche in a way that resembled a spiritual pilgrimage. Third, the Red Book opened new avenues for artists, writers, and thinkers who saw in Jung's inner journey a model for their own creative exploration. The result was not a single, unified reception, but multiple responses, from reverent admiration to critical skepticism, about whether Jung's private visions could legitimately illuminate public theory and whether his process could be distilled into a usable therapeutic method. The release catalyzed a renewed interest in Jung's spirituality, in the intersection of psychology and religion, and in the possibility that the psyche's inner life could be a source of ethical and aesthetic transformation rather than a mere subject of clinical observation. Beyond these anecdotes, Jung's ideas persist in ongoing use within contemporary spiritual and therapeutic communities. In many circles, the language of the psyche's deeper life, shadow, anima/animus, individuation, the self, functions as a practical vocabulary for personal growth, relationship work, and community healing. Shadow work, for example, has become a standard practice in contemporary spiritual communities, mindfulness programs, and trauma-informed care. It involves bringing into awareness the aspects of the self that have remained unconscious or disowned, and reintegrating them into a more authentic and balanced sense of self. The therapeutic utility of this approach lies in its moral and emotional clarity. By naming what has been hidden, one can begin to transform it not by suppressing it, but by understanding its origins, its patterns, and its potential for constructive expression. The anima/animus concept, with its gendered inner figures, continues to offer a language for exploring relationship dynamics and gender identity in ways that can be psychologically insightful rather than reductive or essentialistic. And the broader idea of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a more whole, differentiated person, resonates in contemporary practices that emphasize personal growth, self-knowledge, and ethical responsibility to others. If Jung's legacy looks most durable when it is read as a language rather than a doctrine, then we should also ask, what is being said in the language? Jung's work invites readers to recognize that the psyche is a vehicle for meaning-making that is not reducible to the explicit content of a person's experiences. The symbols that arise, dream images, mythic motifs, artistic motifs, are not incidental decorations, but the psyche's own way of negotiating the tensions that living imposes. Fear and hope, light and shadow, the desire for unity and the reality of conflict. The modern reader can approach Jung with a sense of a living archive, a repository of images and themes that continue to pulse with meaning as they meet new technologies, new cultural formations, and new ethical challenges. In the climate of contemporary spiritual and therapeutic communities, Jung's framework provides a toolkit for dialogic encounters with the self and others, with the past and the future, with the rational and the symbolic. It offers a provocative, sometimes unsettled, but potentially transforming map of inner life. Now, to connect Jung to a broader intellectual conversation, we must include explicit cross-references that deepen the reader's understanding of how Jung sits in a network of ideas. First, Freudian psychoanalysis. Jung's early training under Freud and his subsequent divergence illuminate a crucial pivot in 20th century psychology. Freud's project sought to uncover the unconscious as the hidden engine of behavior, with sexuality often at its center. Jung's project, while not denying the unconscious, expanded the terrain to include spiritual, mythic, and symbolic dimensions. He challenged a reductionist view that the psyche's driving force was only personal or sexual, that there are layers of meaning connected to humanity's collective history. This divergence created a lasting dialogue between two different ways of understanding mind and motive, one that tends to see human behavior as anchored in drives and early development, and another that treats symbol and myth as constitutive of meaning, guiding people through the labyrinths of experience toward a more integrated sense of self. Throughout Jung's career, he remained in conversation with Freudian theory even when he was out of step with it, producing a cross-check that deepened the field's vitality by inviting both psychoanalytic modalities to consider symbol as essential and symbolic modalities to consider personal history as indispensable. Second, existential phenomenology. Jung's emphasis on the interior life aligns with existential questions about authenticity, meaning, and the confrontation with nothingness. Existential phenomenology, thinkers like Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, asks what it means to be in the world, to face the possibilities of choice, to encounter the uncanny dimensions of being, and to live with seriousness about the finite and the mysterious. Jung's project intersects with this inquiry in important ways. The individuation process accords with existential concerns about creating a coherent selfhood that stands up to anxiety and uncertainty. The symbol becomes a language through which a person negotiates the anxiety of being in the world, the confrontation with mortality, and the call to meaning that cannot be supplied by external authorities alone. Jung's insistence that the psyche's healing occurs through a conscious engagement with the inner life, through dreams, symbols, and creative imagination, echoes existentialist ethics. We are asked not simply to accept what is given, but to participate in the ongoing process of becoming. In Jung, the question of authenticity is not a solitary struggle. It is a dialogic engagement with the psyche's symbolic life, a sacred dialogue that invites the self to meet the world with deeper integrity. Third, postmodern critiques of grand narratives. The modern reception of Jung's ideas has often occurred within a cultural moment wary of universal claims and heroic stories of self-realization. Postmodern critique pushes back against the idea that archetypes or any single framework could comprehensively capture the human condition. It invites a skepticism toward totalizing narratives and a preference for plurality, contingency, and local knowledges. Jung's own response to this critique has been to embrace pluralistic interpretations and to emphasize the ambiguity and opacity of symbol. In this sense, Jung's thought becomes a bridge between a modern faith in integrated wholes and a postmodern insistence on multiple vantage points and the contingency of interpretation. If anything, Jung's work invites a guarded humility. The psyche's symbols may be inexhaustibly fruitful, but they resist final, universal claims. The result is a Jungian approach that can be both generous to human diversity and rigorous about the ethical responsibilities that accompany interpretive power. Finally, the influence of Jung on literary theory and popular culture deserves emphasis. In literature, Jung's legacy helps explain why certain works feel mythic or dreamlike in ways that cannot be reduced to explicit arguments. His ideas nourished a tradition of symbolic reading and mythic interpretation that remains active in the analysis of texts, films, and plays. In popular culture, Jungian language has become a common, almost unremarkable, part of everyday speech. Terms like shadow, anima, and individuation appear not only in scholarly articles but in novels, memoirs, and self-help manuals. This is not simply a matter of a fad. It is a testament to the way Jung's images resonate with a broad public's longing to understand how inner life relates to outward life, how stories about the self intersect with stories about communities, and how personal growth can be pursued in a world that often resists depth and complexity. To close, what is at stake in Jung's critique, legacy, and contemporary relevance is not a single doctrine but a living invitation. Jung asks us to pay attention to the symbols that appear in dreams and art, to notice the recurring figures that time and culture repeat, to treat the psyche as a dynamic field capable of growth through encounter with its own images. He challenges us to consider the possibility that our deepest questions, about meaning, about sorrow, about the possibility of wisdom in a chaotic world, might be answered not by reducing life to a chain of efficient causes, but by entering into a dialogue with the psyche's storied life. He offers a vocabulary for that dialogue, the self as center, the persona as mask, the shadow as what we disown, the anima/animus as the intermediation between gendered life and relational experience, the archetypes as spheres of energy that shape perception, and the process of individuation as a lifelong navigation toward a more integrated, authentic being. The conversation is not finished. Jung's thought continues to be tested in clinics that demand empirical rigor, in studios that weigh symbolism against historical context, in spiritual communities that search for meaning beyond doctrine, and in the general public that seeks a language for the mysteries of mind and life. In that sense, Jung remains a figure who embodies a certain stubborn insistence that the mind is not a mere machine but a living theater where ancient patterns, personal history, and future possibilities meet, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in a luminous truce that whispers, in a voice that can feel almost sacred, that to become human is to listen deeply to the images within, to the stories that bind us to the past, and to the unexplained, compelling horizon of what we might yet become. If we listen with care, Jung's story does more than sketch the edges of a theory. It invites a practice of attention. It invites clinicians to attend not only to what patients say, but to how they speak in images, to what dreams reveal in metaphor, to what the symbols that appear in art therapy signal about unresolved longing and unspoken wounds. It invites writers, filmmakers, and artists to attend to the symbolic life as an engine of meaning, not as a decorative garnish. It invites teachers and students to explore myth as a way of thinking and living rather than a historical artifact to be memorized. It invites spiritual communities to acknowledge that the inner life has its own sacred logic, that the psyche can be a site where questions about God, transcendence, and moral formation are not mere private concerns, but questions that touch culture, ethics, and how we attend to others. And while it is essential to hold the criticisms of Jung's work, questions about universality, about the potential essentializing language that accompanies archetypes, about the risk of cultural appropriation, the larger arc remains. Jung challenges us to see the psyche as a field in which meaning is negotiated through image, symbol, and story. He invites skepticism about the idea that all answers reside in the visible or the measurable, and he offers a patient, generous invitation to work with the unknown as a potential source of growth. Whether one accepts all of Jung's claims or not, his insistence that the inner life is worthy of serious attention continues to push psychology, the arts, and many spiritual communities toward a more integrated, more reflective engagement with the questions that haunt us. What is real? How do we know what matters? And who are we becoming when we listen to the inner music of our dreams and imaginations? As we close this section, consider the words of Jung as a signpost rather than a rule. The Jungian vocabulary remains a map with open borders, inviting us to cross into the haunted, luminous territory of the psyche, where images carry weight and meaning lodges itself in the form of symbols that can guide, perturb, and transform. If the critique of universals helps keep us honest, the persistence of archetypal patterns in culture helps remind us that the human imagination seeks shape and coherence in a world that often defies it. If depth psychology remains a living practice in therapy, art, and group work, it is because Jung offered a practice that treats symptoms not merely as problems to be solved, but as messages to be read, interpreted, and integrated. If archetypal language continues to inform narrative theory and popular culture, it is because stories, like dreams, are the mind's most reliable instruments for translating the invisible into something one can dwell with, think through, and live by. This is the enduring, evolving, sometimes contested, but always intriguing legacy of Jungian thought. A prompt to look inward with patience, to listen to the images that arise, and to recognize that the psyche's architecture is as ancient as it is alive, as universal as it is particular, and as hopeful as it is mysterious.